Imagine a world where the most spectacular military disaster you can think of, a campaign so ambitious it was destined for the history books, ends not with a glorious victory, but with a complete and utter collapse. Now imagine that this catastrophic failure, this moment of total humiliation for a mighty empire, doesn't just end a conflict. Instead, it secretly plants the seeds for something beautiful, something lasting, a hidden century of cultural exchange that would quietly reshape an entire continent. This is the true story behind the failed invasion that led to a century of unseen cultural exchange across warring factions, a tale that has remained in the shadows for far too long. We are conditioned to see history as a series of victories and defeats, where the winner takes all and the loser fades into obscurity. But what if the most profound changes, the most enduring connections, were actually forged not in the heat of triumph, but in the cold, hard ashes of defeat? This narrative flips the entire script, inviting you to consider a possibility that challenges our core understanding of how cultures evolve and interact. It suggests that sometimes the bridges between us are built not by the architects of conquest, but by the unintended consequences of a plan gone terribly, terribly wrong. Picture the immense tension of that moment, a vast fleet, the pride of an empire, shattered against a hostile coast. Thousands of soldiers who just days before were the sharp tip of a spear aimed at the heart of an enemy are now stranded, captured, and utterly powerless. In the eyes of their captors, they are a problem to be solved. But what no one could have foreseen was that this human tide of prisoners, this living, breathing residue of a failed ambition, would become the most unlikely ambassadors in history. They carried with them not just their weapons and armor, but their language, their recipes, their songs, their architectural secrets, and their entire way of seeing the world. Forced into close proximity with their sworn enemies, these two cultures, which had defined themselves in opposition to one another for generations, were suddenly faced with a new, undeniable reality. They had to find a way to coexist. From this forced and awkward beginning, a remarkable transformation began to unfold, not in royal courts or through diplomatic treaties, but in farm fields, workshops, kitchens, and marketplaces. This journey we are about to take together will pull back the curtain on this hidden century. We will follow the threads of connection as they were spun from sheer necessity into a rich tapestry of shared life. We will see how a shared meal could become a silent peacemaker, how a new style of music could express a blended identity, and how the children of this unexpected mingling would become the first true citizens of a new world. This is not just a story about the medieval past. It is a story about the resilience of the human spirit and our incredible capacity to find common ground even in the most divisive of circumstances. It's a powerful reminder that progress is not always a straight line, and that the bonds we form through shared experience can be far stronger than the walls we build out of fear. So prepare to uncover a legacy written not in stone on monuments to kings, but in the everyday lives of ordinary people, a legacy born from a failure that ultimately, and surprisingly, succeeded in uniting warring factions in ways no victory ever could. To truly grasp the monumental change that was coming, you have to understand the world as it was in the late 13th century, a continent frozen in a state of hostile equilibrium. Think of it not as a single civilization, but as a fractured chessboard where the two main powers, the Solarian Empire and the Veridian League, glared at each other across a heavily fortified border known as the Serrated Marches. This was not a line on a map, it was a scar across the land, bristling with watchtowers, garrisoned forts, and a no-man's land patrolled by soldiers who had been taught from birth that the people on the other side were little more than monsters. The Solarian Empire, centered in its sun-baked capital of Aurelion, was a realm of rigid hierarchy and ancient ceremony. Its society was built on the principle of imperial glory, with an emperor who was considered the living embodiment of the sun god, his authority absolute and his ambition limitless. Their architecture was grand and intimidating, all soaring arches and gilded domes designed to project an image of unshakable power and divine favor. Their culture prized scholarship, law, and the intricate arts of courtly intrigue, but this sophistication was matched by a deep-seated conviction in their own cultural and military superiority. On the other side of the marches lay the Veridian League, a very different kind of power. It was not a single empire but a confederation of city-states and wooded cantons, bound together by mutual defense pacts and a shared love for their rugged, forested homeland. Where the Solarians worshipped the sun, the Veridians revered the spirits of the ancient woods and the relentless flow of their rivers. Their strength lay in their adaptability, their masterful woodcraft, and a fierce, almost stubborn, independence. Their leaders were not god-kings but elected councils of elders and war chiefs, and their greatest pride was their self-sufficiency. They built not with marble, but with the immense timbers of their forests, creating structures that seemed to grow directly from the landscape, functional and strong. This fundamental difference in worldview, the centralized hierarchical empire versus the decentralized communal league, made each side view the other as not just a political rival, but as a fundamentally alien and morally wrong way of organizing human life. This ideological chasm was deliberately widened by decades of state-sponsored propaganda. In Solarian taverns, bards sang epic poems depicting Veridians as shaggy-haired barbarians who consorted with beasts and practiced dark, druidic magic in their shadowy woods. In Veridian market squares, traveling storytellers spun tales of the Solarians as decadent, gold-obsessed tyrants who sought to pave over the entire natural world and enslave all free peoples under their gilded yoke. Trade between the two was not just minimal, it was actively discouraged by punitive tariffs and the constant threat of confiscation. What little contact existed was filtered through a handful of officially sanctioned and deeply distrusted merchant enclaves in neutral port cities. The flow of ideas was even more restricted. A Solarian scholar caught with a Veridian treatise on herbalism could be accused of treason, while a Veridian artisan incorporating a Solarian decorative motif into their work might be shunned for cultural pollution. This was a world built on walls, both physical and psychological, where the mere idea of a Solarian and a Veridian sharing a meal, let alone a philosophy, was not just unlikely, it was literally unthinkable. This profound and intentional isolation is what makes the events that followed so extraordinary, setting the stage for a historical paradox where the very act of trying to destroy the other would accidentally become the only thing that could bring them together. Now let's meet the man at the very heart of this impending storm, the architect of the grand design that would set these world-altering events into motion. Emperor Aurelion II of the Solarian Empire was not merely a ruler, he was a man possessed by an idea, a vision so powerful it blinded him to all other possibilities. He had ascended the throne not as a seasoned warrior, but as a prince who had spent more time in the imperial libraries than on the training grounds, and this, perhaps, was the source of his fatal flaw. He saw the world not as it was with all its messy complexities, but as it should be according to the ancient prophecies and intricate star charts his court astrologers laid before him. These celestial maps, they whispered, foretold a golden age of Solarian dominance, an era that could only be ushered in by a ruler bold enough to grasp his destiny. Surrounded by sycophantic generals whose careers depended on perpetual conflict, Aurelian II became utterly convinced that the unification of the entire continent under his banner was not just his political right, but his divine duty. This conviction crystallized into a concrete, terrifyingly ambitious war plan known to history as the Crimson Campaign. The name itself was chosen with deliberate symbolism, evoking both the scarlet banners of the Solarian legions and the bloodshed they believed was necessary to cleanse the land of the Veridian blight. This was not a plan for a limited raid or a border adjustment. It was a blueprint for total annihilation, a multi-pronged offensive of staggering complexity. The primary thrust was to be a colossal naval armada, a fleet of over 500 warships and troop transports that would sweep across the narrow sea, bypassing the formidable land defenses of the Serrated marches to launch a direct, shocking amphibious assault on the Veridian League's undefended coastal heartland. Simultaneously, two massive land armies would surge across the border, not to engage in protracted sieges, but to fix the main Veridian defense forces in place, preventing them from rushing to reinforce the coast. The ultimate objective was the swift capture of the League's capital, Veridia Prime, and the complete decapitation of its ruling council of elders in one lightning-fast, decisive blow. To bring this grand design to life, Aurelian II embarked on the most ambitious military mobilization the continent had ever witnessed. He levied crippling new taxes, diverting the empire's immense wealth from public works and granaries into the forges of war. The empire's finest shipwrights worked day and night, their hammers ringing in a dozen harbors as they laid the keels for the great invasion fleet. Engineers, drawing on ancient texts, designed new generations of monstrous siege engines, torsion-powered ballistae that could hurl a spear 1,000 paces and wield siege towers taller than any wall in the Veridian lands. The imperial bureaucracy was tasked with a logistical nightmare, assembling supply trains that stretched for miles, stockpiling enough grain, salted meat, and arrows to sustain an army of tens of thousands for a campaign expected to last an entire season. Every resource, every talent, every ounce of the empire's strength was funneled into this single, all-consuming endeavor. The propaganda machine worked just as tirelessly as the armorers. Across the empire, imperial heralds proclaimed the coming campaign, painting the Veridians not as neighbors with a different way of life, but as inhuman obstacles to Solarian destiny. Soldiers were recruited with promises of fertile Veridian land for every veteran and chests of gold and silver plundered from the League's supposedly overflowing treasuries. The emperor himself toured the muster fields, a radiant figure in gilded armor, giving rousing speeches that framed the invasion as a crusade, a holy war to bring the light of Solarian civilization to the dark, superstitious forests of the enemy. In the intoxicating atmosphere of this military buildup, any voice of caution was dismissed as cowardice or treason. The sheer momentum of the preparation created an unshakable aura of inevitability. To the Solarian High Command and to Aurelion himself, success was not just probable, it was preordained. They looked upon their gleaming legions, their vast fleet, their mountains of supplies, and saw an unstoppable force. They failed to consider that the very scale of their ambition made the entire enterprise brittle, a house of cards that required every single element to go perfectly according to plan. They were preparing for a triumphant victory parade, never once contemplating the possibility that they were, in fact, constructing the mechanism of their own historic and catastrophic downfall. But the meticulously crafted plans of Emperor Aurelion II were about to collide with a brutal and unforgiving reality. The mighty Solarian fleet, a breathtaking spectacle of painted sails and gilded prows, had made good time across the narrow sea. Aboard the flagship, the Sun Chariot, the mood was one of confident anticipation. Admiral Valerius, a veteran of countless coastal raids, reportedly toasted the Emperor's health the night before landfall, assured by his navigators that they were precisely on course for the sheltered bay that was their intended landing zone. What they did not know was that every single assumption underpinning their strategy was fatally flawed. The first sign of catastrophe was not the sight of enemy sails on the horizon, but the color of the sky at dawn. It shifted from a gentle rose to a sickly, bruised purple with terrifying speed. The wind, a steady westerly that had filled their sails for days, died to an eerie calm and then began to blow from the east with a gathering, guttural roar. The sea, once calm, began to swell into mountains of black water. This was no ordinary squall. This was the storm that would be immortalized in Veridian chronicles as the wrath of the sea gods, a tempest of such legendary ferocity that it seemed to possess a vengeful intelligence of its own. In the chaos of the mounting gale, Admiral Valerius desperately ordered the fleet to turn and run for the open sea, a standard maneuver to ride out a storm. But this is where the second layer of the disaster revealed itself. The navigation charts, painstakingly copied from what were believed to be definitive Solarian surveys of the Veridian coast, were nothing more than elegant deceptions. Double agents embedded deep within the Solarian Imperial Cartographers Guild had spent years subtly altering the documents, shifting the locations of treacherous submerged reefs and sandbars, and erasing entire promontories from existence. The deep, safe channel the fleet sought to follow was a fantasy. The Sun Chariot, leading the desperate retreat, was the first to strike. The sickening crunch of its hull splintering on a razor-sharp reef was a sound swallowed by the storm, but the result was immediate and catastrophic. The great ship lurched, its mast snapping like a twig, and was quickly pounded to pieces by the colossal waves. One by one, following their flagship blindly in the near-zero visibility, other vessels met the same grim fate. Galleys designed for calm coastal waters were swamped and capsized. Sturdy transport ships, overloaded with men, horses, and siege equipment, wallowed helplessly before being dashed against the very rocks their charts claimed were miles away. The screams of drowning men were a futile counterpoint to the symphony of the storm. While the sea itself tore the heart out of the Solarian invasion force, the land component of the plan was unraveling with similar precision, thanks to the Veridian League's masterful use of intelligence. The League's spymaster, a shadowy figure known only as the Grey Fox, had spent a fortune and decades cultivating a network of agents within the Solarian court and military. They had not only provided the false charts but had delivered the Crimson Campaign's complete order of battle and timetable to the Veridian Council of Elders weeks in advance. Forewarned, the Veridians did not make the mistake of meeting the massive Solarian land armies in a pitched battle, which was exactly what the Solarian generals wanted. Instead, they implemented a strategy of targeted harassment and strategic withdrawal. Veridian rangers, masters of their wooded terrain, constantly harried the Solarian supply lines, burning wagons and poisoning wells. They felled ancient trees across narrow mountain passes, slowing the legions to a crawl. Small, mobile bands of Veridian archers launched devastating ambushes from the cover of the forests, melting away before the heavily armored Solarian infantry could form up for a proper engagement. The Solarian armies, built for decisive, set-piece battles, found themselves bleeding from 1,000 tiny cuts, their advance stalling far from their objectives, their morale crumbling in the face of an enemy they could rarely even see. This confluence of natural disaster, espionage, and strategic misjudgment resulted in a military catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. The Grand Invasion, the Crimson Campaign into which the Solarian Empire had poured its entire treasury and its boundless pride, was over before a single major battle could be fought on Veridian soil. The naval armada was simply gone, reduced to flotsam and drowned ambition. The land armies, isolated, undersupplied, and demoralized, found themselves bogged down in the outer fringes of the serrated marches, unable to advance or retreat without suffering devastating losses. The most immediate and profound consequence, however, was the human toll. Thousands of Solarian soldiers and support personnel who had managed to struggle ashore from the wrecked fleet, or who had been cut off from their retreating land units, now found themselves stranded, weaponless, and utterly helpless on enemy territory. They were not conquerors, they were a massive, disorganized, and terrified mass of prisoners of war. In a single, storm-racked week, the Solarian Empire had not just lost a military campaign, it had lost a significant portion of an entire generation of its men, leaving them not dead, but alive and captive within the very culture they had been sent to destroy. This unprecedented situation, this accidental diaspora of tens of thousands of Solarians into the heart of the Veridian League, created the bizarre and fertile ground from which an entirely unexpected future would begin to grow. Imagine the scene from the Veridian perspective. For days, the coast was littered with the wreckage of proud ships and the exhausted, half-drowned survivors of the once mighty Solarian army. The initial euphoria of their deliverance from the storm and the spies' warning quickly gave way to a staggering logistical problem. They were suddenly responsible for tens of thousands of defeated, hungry, and terrified enemy soldiers. This was not a small group of prisoners to be thrown into a dungeon. This was a massive, displaced population larger than some of their own major cities. The Veridian League's Council of Elders, gathered in an emergency session in Veridia Prime, was faced with a choice with no good options. The traditional, brutal logic of war would have suggested mass execution to eliminate the threat and avenge past conflicts. Yet the elders recoiled from this. They were a practical people, and such a slaughter would not only stain their honor for generations, but would also guarantee a blood feud with the Solarian Empire that would burn for centuries, a cycle of vengeance with no end. They understood that becoming monsters to defeat a monster was its own form of defeat. On the other hand, simply sending the prisoners home was equally unthinkable. The logistical effort to escort tens of thousands of men back across the fortified border would have drained their own resources and exposed their military to counterattack. More importantly, from a strategic standpoint, it made no sense. To return this entire, battle-hardened army to the Solarian Emperor would be to hand him back the very instrument of his ambition, allowing him to rebuild and potentially try again in a few years. The council was trapped between morality and realpolitik, between their conscience and their cold calculation of survival. It was in this pressure cooker of impossible choices that a third, more radical path was proposed. Instead of seeing the captives as a problem to be disposed of, they could be seen as a resource. The war, while averted, had still strained the League's economy and manpower. Farms needed workers to feed the population, roads and fortifications needed repair and expansion, and the great timber halls of the nobility required skilled hands for maintenance. The Solarian prisoners, they realized, represented a vast pool of labor, and so the council issued its fateful decree. There would be no mass executions, and there would be no repatriation. Instead, the tens of thousands of Solarian captives were to be formally classified as indentured laborers. They were to be systematically dispersed in small groups across the entire breadth of the Veridian League, from the bustling port cities to the remote inland villages. They would be put to work in the fields, in the quarries, in the forests, and in the households of Veridian citizens. Their labor would pay for their own upkeep and contribute to the rebuilding and strengthening of the very society they had intended to conquer. This was not presented as an act of charity, but one of harsh necessity. The Solarians were not given the status of free citizens or even paid servants. They were a captive workforce, their lives and futures entirely dependent on the will of their Veridian hosts. This system of indentured servitude, while far from humane by modern standards, was a revolutionary alternative to the massacre or imprisonment that would have defined any other era. The immediate consequence of this dispersal was the creation of a forced diaspora, a sudden and unprecedented seeding of Solarian culture into the most intimate corners of the Veridian world. Think of it not as a single event, but as a great scattering. One day, a remote Veridian farming village knew of the Solarians only as distant mythical villains from fireside tales. The next, a group of 20 weary, defeated Solarian soldiers, their fine uniforms in tatters, would be marched into the village square by a Veridian warden and assigned to work alongside the local farmers. The same scene played out in 100 different contexts. A master stonemason from the Solarian capital, who had expected to be designing siege engines, found himself put to work repairing the foundation of a Veridian bridge. A Solarian army cook, skilled in the use of exotic spices, was set to work in the kitchen of a Veridian noble house. A young scribe, trained in the intricate Solarian script, was tasked with helping a Veridian merchant untangle his accounts. This was not a cultural exchange program, it was a coercive integration born from desperation. Yet, in this forced proximity, something remarkable began to happen. The abstract concept of the enemy suddenly had a face, a name, and a skill. The foundational human contacts, the countless daily interactions between captor and captive, between local and foreigner, began to form the first, fragile threads of a new understanding, weaving the two hostile cultures together in a way that no diplomat or treaty ever could have managed. In the months that followed the Great Dispersal, a quiet revolution began in the fields, workshops, and market stalls of the Veridian League. It did not start with grand philosophical debates or artistic masterpieces, but with the most fundamental human need, the need to be understood. Picture a Veridian farm overseer, let's call him Kale, standing in a muddy field of a grain he calls sun wheat. He's trying to explain to a group of weary Solarian prisoners how to properly harvest it without damaging the stalks. He points and gestures, his words a meaningless stream of guttural Veridian syllables to the Solarians' ears. They, in turn, try to ask about water breaks using the flowing, vowel-rich sounds of their own tongue, which to Kale sounds like frivolous singing. The initial communication was a pantomime of frustration, pointed fingers, exaggerated gestures, and faces etched with mutual misunderstanding. This was the raw, unvarnished reality on the ground. The first and most critical bridge that had to be built between these two peoples was not one of stone or timber, but one of words and sounds, a linguistic bridge constructed out of sheer, unyielding necessity. Survival itself depended on it. A misunderstood command about felling a tree could lead to a fatal accident. A miscommunication about the preparation of food could result in sickness. In this pressured environment, language was not an academic pursuit. It was a practical tool for getting through the day alive and with all one's limbs intact. This pressure to communicate forged the first crude pidgin dialects almost overnight. It began with the names for things, simple, concrete nouns that were essential for daily tasks. The Veridian word for water, aqua, and the Solarian word, hydro, collided in the fields, and soon a blended term like aquadro might be used by both groups. The Solarian word for tool, instrumentum, was paired with the Veridian word for hammer, malleus, leading to shared understandings. But this exchange quickly moved beyond simple vocabulary for objects. The Solarian soldiers, a conscripted force, contained within their ranks a surprising number of literate men, sons of merchants, junior scribes, and even low-level bureaucrats who had been pressed into military service. Their skills, once used for mustering rolls and supply lists, suddenly found a new and unexpected value. A Veridian merchant struggling with a chaotic system of tally sticks and memory to track the influx of goods from the dispersed laborers might find himself working with a captured Solarian scribe. The scribe, eager to secure a slightly better position or extra rations, would demonstrate the elegant efficiency of the Solarian alphabetical script and their base 10 numerical system. He would show how one could record a transaction for 500 bushels of grain with just a few precise symbols, rather than a cumbersome bundle of notched sticks. The merchant, initially suspicious, would soon recognize the sheer economic advantage. This knowledge didn't stay confined to one merchant. It spread like a beneficial contagion, moving from marketplace to marketplace, adopted not out of cultural submission, but out of pragmatic recognition of a superior system for organizing complex information. The flow of knowledge was not a one-way street from the sophisticated captives to their rustic captors. In fact, one of the most significant early transfers went in the opposite direction, from the Veridian farmers to the Solarian laborers. The Solarians, hailing from a more arid, sun-drenched empire, were masters of irrigated agriculture, growing familiar staples like olives, grapes, and hardy grains. The Veridian landscape, with its dense forests, humid air, and different soil composition, was a world apart. Their primary crops were robust tubers, dark-leafed greens that thrived in partial shade, and a strange, fast-growing vine fruit that the Solarians had never seen. A Solarian soldier assigned to a farm, trying to tend to these unfamiliar plants as he would his own crops, could easily doom an entire harvest. The Veridian farmers, whose very identity was tied to their deep understanding of the land, were forced to become teachers. They demonstrated their sophisticated crop rotation methods, which preserved soil vitality. They showed the prisoners how to read the signs of the forest for impending weather changes, a skill the city-bred Solarian scribes found nearly mystical. They taught them the secrets of cultivating the local fungi and which wild berries were safe to eat. This was not charity. A failed harvest meant hunger for everyone, Veridian and Solarian alike. The success of the land became a shared, non-negotiable goal, and the language of agriculture, the words for blight, for fertile soil, for the perfect time to harvest became a common vocabulary of mutual survival and prosperity. As this basic, functional language solidified, something beautiful and entirely unplanned began to happen. The bridge built for commands and technical instructions soon found itself carrying a much richer and more human cargo. Once a Solarian laborer and a Veridian overseer could share a laugh over a mispronounced word, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. The stark categories of captor and captive began to blur around the edges. During breaks from their labor, a Solarian might teach a Veridian a catchy, marching cadence from his homeland, its rhythms evoking the wide, dusty plains of the empire. In return, around a fireside in the evening, a Veridian might share a haunting folk ballad about a forest spirit, its melody echoing the whisper of wind through pine needles. Jokes were attempted, often failing spectacularly at first due to different cultural contexts, but the very act of trying to make the other person laugh created a bond. Stories were shared, not the state-sanctioned propaganda of monstrous enemies, but personal stories of families back home, of lost loves, of hopes for the future. The Solarian prisoner was no longer just a Solarian. He was a man named Lucian who missed his daughter's laugh. The Veridian overseer was no longer just a Veridian. He was a man named Kale who worried about his aging father. This slow, persistent erosion of otherness was the true, transformative power of this linguistic fusion. It demonstrated that beneath the armor of political identity and national prejudice, the fundamental experiences of joy, sorrow, fear, and aspiration were universally human. This grassroots linguistic connection, born in the mud and toil of everyday survival, became the indispensable foundation, the primary vehicle upon which all the magnificent and complex cultural exchanges of the coming century would travel. While the farmers and laborers were building a common language in the fields, a different, more formal kind of exchange was taking place in the workshops and construction sites of the Veridian elite. The dispersal of the captured Solarian host had been a practical solution, but it also acted as a massive, unplanned talent assessment. As local Veridian lords and guild masters surveyed their new indentured workforce, they quickly realized that among the common soldiers were individuals possessing extraordinary, highly specialized skills. A lord overseeing the construction of a new fortified manor might discover that the man he had assigned to haul stones was, in his previous life, a master stonemason from the Solarian capital, trained in the precise art of cutting and setting the intricate ashlar blocks that made Solarian architecture so renowned. A guild master of weavers might find that a group of women assigned to kitchen duties had, in fact, been artisans in a famed Solarian tapestry workshop. Their value as mere manual laborers was negligible compared to their potential as masters of their craft. Pragmatism once again overrode prejudice. Almost immediately, these artisans, the stonemasons, weavers, metalworkers, and glassblowers, were pulled from the fields and quarries and reassigned to the most prestigious projects the Veridian League had to offer. This redeployment placed Solarian artistic sensibilities directly at the heart of Veridian cultural expression. Imagine a Veridian cathedral, for generations a monument to sturdy, vertical timber construction and carved wooden saints. Now a team of Solarian stonemasons is set to work on its new bell tower. They bring with them an entirely different architectural philosophy. Where the Veridians built for strength and integration with the forest, the Solarians built for eternity and the glory of the sun. These masons introduced the use of the pointed arch and the ribbed vault, techniques that allowed for taller, more luminous structures that seemed to reach for the heavens in a way the heavier Veridian style never could. They taught their Veridian apprentices how to carve flowing, floral motifs and complex geometric patterns into the stone, motifs that spoke of sunrays and blooming deserts rather than tangled roots and oak leaves. The Veridian craftsmen, initially wary, could not deny the technical brilliance and aesthetic power of these new forms. They began to incorporate them not as slavish copies but as inspired additions. The result was a new architectural language, a cathedral that still felt fundamentally Veridian in its mass and presence, but now soared with a Solarian-inspired grace, its stone facades telling a blended story of forest and sun. One of the most luminous examples of this fusion came from the most fragile of arts, glassblowing. The Veridians were proficient in making functional glass for windows' thick, greenish panes that let in a muted, underwater light. A captured Solarian glassblower, however, held the secret to creating the vibrant, jewel-toned stained glass that was the glory of Solarian temples. He knew the precise formulas for mixing metallic oxides into molten glass to create deep blues from cobalt, fiery reds from gold, and brilliant purples from manganese. Under the watchful eyes of Veridian guildsmen, he began to demonstrate this alchemy. But a simple transfer of knowledge was not what occurred. The Veridians, masters of their environment, introduced him to locally sourced minerals that produced unique color palettes unavailable in the Solarian homeland. They used a particular river clay to create a distinctive earthy green and ground a specific local lichen to produce a soft, silvery gray. The Solarian techniques merged with Veridian materials, giving birth to a new hybrid style of stained glass. The scenes depicted also began to blend. A classic Solarian image of the sun god might now be surrounded by a border of Veridian forest creatures, all rendered in this new, uniquely local color spectrum. These windows became breathtakingly beautiful records of the collaboration, filtering sunlight into a tangible representation of the two cultures merging into one. This exchange was far from one-sided. While the Solarian artisans were transforming the Veridian landscape, they were also being quietly transformed by the technical genius of their hosts. The Veridians, living in a land of powerful rivers and dense mechanics, had achieved marvels of precision engineering that surpassed anything in the Solarian Empire. Their most prized secret was the intricate weight-driven clockwork that powered their public timepieces and astronomical devices. A Solarian metalworker, assigned to assist a Veridian clockmaker, would have been astounded by the complexity of gears, escapements, and foliates that could mark the passage of hours with a reliability that Solarian water clocks and sundials could never match. This knowledge was priceless. The Veridian masters, proud of their craft and recognizing a skilled metalworker regardless of his origin, would often share their principles, demonstrating how to cut a gear for minimal friction or how to calibrate a weight for consistent power. This was not treason. It was the universal pride of a master craftsman sharing the secrets of his life's work with a capable apprentice. The Solarian artisans, in turn, absorbed this knowledge, and through letters carried by clandestine networks or memories held for a future return, these secrets of Veridian mechanics began their slow, inevitable journey back to the Solarian homeland, where they would eventually revolutionize timekeeping and machine design. In this way, these craftsmen and artisans, though they lived and worked under the official status of prisoners, became the most effective diplomats this Cold War had ever produced. Their work was not written on fragile parchment that could be burned or forgotten. It was etched in stone, woven into tapestries, set in glass, and embodied in machinery. A Veridian noble living in a manor with Solarian-inspired stone tracery was daily confronted with the beauty and sophistication of the culture he was supposed to despise. A Solarian artisan returning home with the principles of Veridian clockwork carried back proof that the barbarians of the forest possessed a scientific intellect that demanded respect. Their dialogue was conducted not with words, but with the chisel, the loom, and the crucible. They built a silent, compelling argument for the value of the other, creating a permanent and highly visible cultural record that stood as a lasting monument to the unexpected fruits of a failed invasion. Their legacy was not in treaties signed, but in the very skyline of the Veridian League, which now reached for the sun with a new, hybrid grandeur. While the artisans were reshaping the skyline and scholars were trading secrets in the scriptoriums, a quieter but equally profound revolution was simmering in the kitchens and around the cookfires of the Veridian League. The Solarian palate, accustomed to the complex, layered flavors of a sun-drenched empire, initially recoiled at the straightforward, hearty nature of Veridian fare. Veridian cuisine was built for sustenance and the long, cold winters. It was a world of thick stews, dense black bread, roasted game, and root vegetables, all seasoned with little more than salt and a handful of familiar forest herbs. To the Solarian captives, it felt bland and monotonous. Yet, hunger is a powerful motivator, and the Solarians quickly realized that their knowledge of food was a form of currency, a way to improve their own daily existence and, in the process, bridge the gap to their captors. They began by introducing the very concept of the sauce, transforming a simple pot of boiled meat and tubers into something extraordinary. A Solarian cook in a manor kitchen might demonstrate how to create a rich, slow-cooked reduction using meat drippings, wild onions, and a splash of sharp, local cider. then finish it with a paste made from crushed nuts and herbs, a technique that added a depth of flavor the Veridians had never experienced. This was not just about making food taste better, it was a revelation in culinary possibility. The exchange, however, was far from a one-way street of Solarian sophistication imposed on Veridian simplicity. The Veridians possessed a deep, generations-old mastery of their own landscape, a knowledge that was utterly foreign to the invaders. They knew which mushrooms found at the base of ancient oaks were safe and savory, and which deceptively beautiful red-capped ones brought a swift and painful end. They taught the Solarians how to forage for tart, crimson berries that grew in sun-dappled clearings, perfect for creating vibrant, sharp jellies that cut through the richness of game. Most importantly, the Veridians were virtuosos of fermentation, a crucial skill for preserving the summer's bounty through the harsh winter. They showed the Solarian laborers how to create not just simple beers, but complex, tangy sauerkrauts from shredded cabbage, how to pickle everything from wild green beans to birds' eggs in vinegar infused with forest herbs, and how to craft potent, smoky cheeses in caves that maintained a perfect, cool temperature year-round. This was knowledge born of necessity and a profound intimacy with the rhythm of the seasons, and the Solarians, many of whom came from a land where food was more readily available, absorbed these lessons with a newfound respect for Veridian ingenuity. This cross-pollination of culinary wisdom inevitably led to the creation of entirely new, hybrid foodstuffs that became symbols of the emerging blended culture. The most famous example was the birth of Verdant Ale. The Solarians had a sophisticated understanding of using dried, aromatic hops to bitter and preserve their beers, a practice less common in the Veridian lands, where brews were often thicker, sweeter, and spiced with heather or bog myrtle. A Solarian brewer, indentured at a Veridian monastery, collaborated with the local monk who was the keeper of the abbey's prized barley fields. The monk provided the grain, a particularly robust and flavorful local barley strain, while the Solarian introduced the precise timing and quantity of hop additions during the boiling process. The result was a beverage that was entirely new. It had the clean, refreshing bitterness and preservative quality of a Solarian beer, but was built upon the hearty, malty backbone of the finest Veridian barley. It was a smash success. This Verdant Ale quickly spread from the monastery to taverns across the Borderlands, becoming the drink of choice in public houses where Veridians and Solarians now sat at the same long tables, their shared enjoyment of this new creation forging bonds over clinking tankards. Perhaps the most significant impact of this culinary exchange was not the food itself, but the social spaces it created. The shared meal became a powerful, unofficial zone of truce. In the bustling marketplaces of border towns, Solarian-inspired meat pies, now filled with local game and seasoned with a mix of Solarian and Veridian spices, were sold from stalls right next to Veridian stews that had been transformed with a splash of wine and a pinch of exotic spice. People from both cultures would gather around the same communal pots, breaking their bread together. Within the manor kitchens, the hierarchical barriers between a Veridian noble and a Solarian cook blurred over the tasting of a new sauce. In the cramped quarters of army camps, Veridian soldiers and their Solarian laborers found themselves sharing a single pot of a new, efficient grain and lentil porridge that had been developed to feed large groups, a recipe that combined Solarian logistical planning with Veridian hardtack. In these shared sensory experiences, the political labels of conqueror and captive melted away, replaced by the universal human language of a satisfied palate. A Veridian might compliment a Solarian on the perfect balance of flavors in a dish, and a Solarian might express genuine gratitude for being introduced to the earthy sweetness of a roasted forest mushroom. This was diplomacy conducted with a spoon, not a sword. It proved, in the most direct and personal way possible, that culture is not just something abstract to be debated or fought over. It is something that can be absorbed, appreciated, and loved through the most fundamental of human experiences, the simple, shared act of tasting and finding something delicious together. Far from the bustling kitchens and noisy construction sites, a different kind of fusion was taking place in the hushed, hallowed spaces of Veridian monasteries and libraries. Here, among towering shelves of parchment and the soft scratch of quills, the captured Solarian scholars and monks found a purpose that transcended their captivity. These were men whose lives had been dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge, and the Veridians, pragmatic as ever, recognized that their minds were far too valuable to waste on manual labor. Instead, they were assigned to the scriptoriums and archives, tasked with copying texts, organizing records, and assisting the Veridian clerics. For a Solarian scholar like Brother Cashin, who had spent his life studying the intricate legal commentaries of the Imperial Sun Court, his new environment was a shock. The Veridian libraries were not organized around centralized codes of law, but around sprawling genealogies, herbal compendiums, and complex astronomical charts that mapped the movements of constellations he had never seen from his southern homeland. It was here, amidst this foreign wisdom, that a silent, profound seepage of knowledge began, a transfer that would reshape the intellectual foundations of both cultures. The first major contribution of these Solarian intellectuals was in the realm of governance. The Veridian League, a confederation of independent-minded cantons, relied on a patchwork of local customs and oral traditions to settle disputes and administer justice. It was a system that worked for small, cohesive communities but was showing its strain as the League grew more complex. Brother Cashin, while helping to catalogue the monastery's legal documents, saw the confusion firsthand. He cautiously began to demonstrate the principles of Solarian civil law to his Veridian hosts. He explained the concept of a unified legal code where laws were written down, standardized, and applied consistently to everyone from the lowest farmer to the highest elder. He showed them the Solarian system of bureaucratic record-keeping, the use of census rolls, land registries, and tax ledgers that created a clear picture of the realm's resources and inhabitants. The Veridian administrators, initially skeptical of this foreign rigidity, soon grasped its immense practical power. They saw how it could reduce inter-canton squabbles, streamline tax collection, and create a stronger, more centralized state capable of managing the new realities of their post-invasion world. Quietly, and without any official decree, elements of the Solarian legal and administrative framework were woven into the fabric of Veridian governance, making it more efficient and resilient, a classic example of adopting a better tool, regardless of its origin. But the flow of knowledge was never a one-way street. While the Solarians were sharing the architecture of law, the Veridians were unveiling the secrets of the cosmos and the human body. The Veridians were unparalleled astronomers. Their observatories, perched on high peaks, housed intricate brass astrolabes and armillary spheres of a complexity that dwarfed anything in the Solarian Empire. Their star charts did not just map constellations for navigation. They detailed the precise orbits of planets and predicted lunar eclipses with an accuracy that seemed like magic to the Solarian scholars. A Solarian monk named Linus, assigned to assist the master astronomer of the Grey Peak Monastery, found himself utterly captivated. He spent nights tracing the paths of foreign stars, learning to calculate celestial events with a precision he had never dreamed possible. With the fervor of a true scholar, he began meticulously copying these treatises and star charts, his neat Solarian script filling the margins with notes and questions. These documents were far too valuable to keep to himself. through the same clandestine networks that smuggled letters and small goods between the realms. These copied astronomical texts began their slow journey back to the Solarian homeland, where they would eventually revolutionize their understanding of the heavens and navigation. The same quiet revolution was happening in the field of medicine. Solarian medicine was largely based on the theory of bodily humors and relied heavily on prayer and standardized, often ineffective, remedies. Veridian medicine, by contrast, was startlingly empirical. Their healers, often women who served as the community's wise women, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local herbs, but they also practiced a form of surgery based on direct observation and anatomy. They set broken bones with remarkable skill, used sutures made from animal gut to close wounds, and even performed a primitive form of cataract surgery. A Solarian scholar with a background in natural philosophy, working in a monastery's infirmary, would have been both horrified and fascinated. He would watch as a Veridian healer successfully treated a deep sword wound with a poultice of moldy bread, a practice the Solarians would have dismissed as superstition, but which we now recognize as an early, accidental use of antibiotics. He would see them brew a tea from willow bark to ease pain and reduce fever. These Solarian scholars, setting aside their preconceptions, became the most diligent of students. They compiled detailed notebooks describing these Veridian techniques and herbal recipes, creating illustrated guides to local plants and their medicinal properties. These notebooks, too, were copied and smuggled east, carrying back a treasure trove of practical medical knowledge that would save countless lives in the empire for generations to come. This entire intellectual exchange operated in a fascinating space entirely separate from the political world. There were no treaties signed between the Solarian Emperor and the Veridian Council to facilitate this trade in ideas. It was an organic process driven purely by the shared, insatiable curiosity of the scholars themselves. A Veridian monk and his Solarian counterpart, bent over the same ancient text, were not enemies. They were collaborators in a greater quest for understanding. They debated the nature of comets, compared surgical techniques, and argued philosophy by candlelight, their shared identity as men of learning trumping their national identities. This created a pan-continental scholarly community, an invisible college that communicated through coded messages, smuggled manuscripts, and the trusted networks of traveling monks. They developed their own ethical code, one that prioritized the preservation and advancement of knowledge above the transient squabbles of kings and generals. In the quiet scriptoriums of the Veridian League, the most powerful weapon against entrenched hostility was not a sword but a shared question. The quest for knowledge, it turned out, possessed a unique and profound power to build bridges where politics had only ever built walls, proving that the human drive to understand the world could indeed transcend the deepest and most bitter enmities. Perhaps the most breathtaking and permanent record of this hidden century of exchange was written not on parchment, but in stone and timber, rising from the very soil of the contested Borderlands. If you were to travel through the Serrated marches a generation after the failed invasion, you would witness a startling transformation in the skyline. The fortresses that once defined the frontier were undergoing a profound metamorphosis, their very forms telling a new, silent story of collaboration. The old Veridian keeps, which had been formidable in their own right, were primarily structures of vertical strength. They were tall, square towers of dark, rugged timber and rough-hewn stone, built to blend into the forested cliffs and command the high ground. Their design philosophy was one of endurance and intimidation, a reflection of a people who saw their landscape as both a shield and a sacred trust. But now something new was appearing around these ancient cores. You would see these older structures being enveloped by new outer walls that followed a completely different logic, the sophisticated, geometric genius of Solarian military engineering. The Veridian lords, pragmatic men responsible for the defense of their lands, were the first to recognize the sheer brilliance of the Solarian approach to fortification. While their own castles were strong, the Solarian concepts of concentric defense and rounded towers presented a revolutionary leap forward. A classic Veridian square tower had vulnerable corners that could be slowly chipped away by mining or battered by siege engines. The Solarian rounded tower, by contrast, deflected projectiles and made mining far more difficult. More importantly, the idea of concentric walls, a lower outer wall and a higher inner wall, created a deadly killing ground. An attacking force that breached the first wall would find themselves trapped in a narrow courtyard, exposed to a withering crossfire from the inner defenses. This was not just a different style, it was a different way of thinking about defense in depth. A Veridian baron, overseeing the renovation of his family's ancestral fortress, would have consulted with the very same Solarian stonemasons and engineers who were his indentured laborers. He would have seen the models they sketched in the dirt, understood the tactical advantages, and made the cold, practical decision to adopt the designs of his former enemy. It was a testament to the power of a good idea to transcend prejudice. Survival, after all, was a universal language. Yet, as these Solarian defensive features were being integrated, a fascinating reverse flow of innovation was occurring within the castle walls. The Solarians, for all their mastery of grand-scale military architecture, had often prioritized imposing strength over daily comfort. Their great fortresses in the arid south could be drafty, damp, and notoriously difficult to keep warm in the winter, with smoky open hearths and poor ventilation. The Veridians, by contrast, were masters of interior livability, born from a necessity to survive long, freezing winters in their forested holds. As they worked alongside their Solarian counterparts, they introduced transformative technologies that the Solarian engineers watched with keen interest. The most celebrated of these was the Veridian hypocaust system, an intricate network of underground clay pipes and channels that funneled heat from a central furnace through the stone floors of the Great Hall and living quarters, providing a consistent, radiant warmth that was far superior to any Solarian heating method. They also shared their expertise in sophisticated water management, building covered and protected aqueducts that fed into deep, stone-lined cisterns within the fortress, ensuring a fresh water supply even during a prolonged siege, a stark contrast to the often vulnerable external wells of Solarian design. This beautiful, unspoken trade Solarian defensive strength for Veridian domestic ingenuity gave birth to an entirely new architectural language that historians would later dub the Borderland style. A prime example was the fortress of Raven's Crag, which still stands today as a monument to this era. From a distance, it presented a distinctly Solarian silhouette, multiple tiers of sleek, curved stone walls, one nestled within the other, their profiles designed to deflect artillery and frustrate assault. But upon entering, a visitor would be greeted by a uniquely Veridian sense of warmth and integration. The Great Hall, though grand in the Solarian fashion, was heated by a Veridian hypocaust, making it habitable year-round. Its large windows, a Solarian feature for light and air, were fitted with Veridian-style internal wooden shutters for insulation. The inner courtyards featured Veridian herb gardens and cleverly designed drainage systems that channeled rainwater into those secure internal cisterns. It was a fortress that was not only harder to capture but also far more pleasant to live in, a direct result of its hybrid origins. These borderland fortresses became the ultimate physical manifestation of the intertwined destinies of the two peoples. They were not symbols of one culture's dominance over the other, nor were they awkward pastiches. They were organic, functional fusions, where every stone and timber joint represented a practical solution born from shared necessity and mutual respect for the other's expertise. A Solarian rounded tower wasn't just copied, it was adapted using local Veridian stone and building techniques, giving it a slightly different, more rugged character. A Veridian Great Hall wasn't just retrofitted with a new heating system. Its very layout was often rethought by Solarian architects to improve circulation and light. These structures stood as massive, undeniable facts on the landscape. They were a daily, visible reminder to everyone who lived in or beheld them that the old, rigid divisions were crumbling, replaced by something new, resilient, and profoundly collaborative. The walls, originally designed to keep people out, had ironically become the very thing that enclosed and protected a budding new culture, a culture forged not in victory, but in the pragmatic and brilliant aftermath of a shared catastrophe. Even as the royal courts in both Aurelia and Veridia Prime continued to loudly proclaim their eternal enmity and uphold the official trade embargoes, a powerful new reality was taking root in the shadowy spaces between their empires. The cultural exchanges of the past decades had, almost accidentally, created a marketplace. Veridian nobles, having grown accustomed to the luxurious feel of Solarian silks and the brilliance of their exotic dyes at feasts where former captives now served as household stewards, developed an insatiable appetite for these foreign luxuries. They wanted their great halls to shimmer with the same vibrant colors they saw in the newly installed stained glass, and their wives and daughters desired gowns that flowed with a sophistication their own rustic weavers could not yet replicate. On the other side of the border, Solarian elites, once they were exposed to the masterful craftsmanship of Veridian artisans through gifts or smuggled samples, began to covet what their own culture could not produce. They marveled at the strength and flexibility of Veridian steel, forged in secret forest bloomeries using techniques passed down for generations, which made sword blades that were both lighter and more durable. They developed a taste for the intricate wood carvings that depicted forest spirits and mythical beasts with a breathtaking, organic realism, seeing in them a primal artistry that their own more formal sculptures lacked. This burgeoning demand, cultivated in the drawing rooms and manor houses of the elite, created a powerful economic vacuum that official policy could no longer suppress. Into this vacuum stepped the most pragmatic and adaptable class in either society, the merchant guilds. These were not romantic adventurers, but shrewd calculators of profit and loss who recognized that the political declarations of kings and councils were far less powerful than the simple, universal desire for beautiful and rare things. Seeing immense profit where their rulers saw only political contamination, these guilds became the architects of a new, invisible economy. They established complex and clandestine smuggling networks that operated with the precision of a military campaign. Cargoes of Solarian silk would be transported overland on remote mountain paths by sure-footed mule trains, guided by Borderlanders who knew every hidden pass. Veridian steel, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, would be shipped on small, fast coastal vessels that moved only by moonless night, landing on deserted beaches to be met by waiting carts. The great neutral port city of Telmarath, perched on a rocky island between the two powers, became the bustling, unofficial capital of this illicit trade. Here, in smoky taverns where the common tongue was a pidgin blend of both languages, guild factors from the Solarian Crimson Lotus Consortium would haggle openly with representatives of the Veridian Timber Fist Guild, their negotiations conducted in whispers and sealed with handshakes that carried more weight than any royal seal. This burgeoning economic activity gave rise to a powerful new social force, a transnational merchant class whose wealth and influence began to rival, and in some cases even surpass, that of the old landed aristocracy. A merchant prince in Telmarath, whose warehouses held fortunes in both Solarian silks and Veridian steel, owed no primary loyalty to either emperor or elder. His loyalty was to commerce itself, to the steady, reliable flow of goods that filled his coffers. For these individuals and the powerful guilds they represented, the idea of a return to open war was not a patriotic call to arms, it was an existential threat. A new invasion, or even a serious border clash, would immediately shatter their meticulously built supply chains, scare off their trade partners, and lead to the confiscation of their assets. Their entire fortune was built upon the fragile, unofficial peace that had persisted since the Great Dispersal. Consequently, these merchants became the most potent, if quiet, lobbyists for peace. They used their vast wealth to bribe border officials to look the other way, funded local militias in border towns to ensure stability rather than aggression, and even funneled money to political factions within both courts that favored a more pragmatic, less confrontational foreign policy. They understood that their prosperity was now inextricably linked to the continued, peaceful interaction between the two cultures. What began as a simple black market for luxury goods soon evolved into a deep and structural economic interdependence that wove the two economies together at a fundamental level. It was no longer just about silks for the nobles or steel for the elites. Solarian glassmakers, for instance, found they could not replicate the unique earthy green of their Veridian hybrid stained glass without a specific clay that could only be sourced from a single riverbed deep within the League's territory. Veridian brewers of the famous Sun Verdant Ale discovered that their product lost its distinctive character if they substituted a local hop for the specific aromatic strain the Solarians had introduced. The Borderlands themselves became hubs of specialized manufacturing, where raw materials from one side were processed using techniques from the other. A workshop in a mixed town might use Veridian timber and Solarian joinery methods to produce furniture that was both incredibly sturdy and elegantly designed, selling it at a premium to customers on both sides of the border. This was no longer a simple exchange of finished goods. It was a fusion of supply chains where the production of a single item now required components, raw materials, and knowledge from both empires. To sever this connection would not merely deprive nobles of their luxuries, it would collapse entire local economies, throw thousands of artisans out of work, and create shortages of goods that had become staples in daily life. Commerce, the great leveler, had done what no diplomat or general could ever achieve. It had made the two warring factions not just neighbors, but essential partners, binding them in a web of mutual economic interest that proved far more resilient than any treaty. Out in the misty valleys and rolling hills of the Borderlands, where the rigid authority of both empires grew faint, a quiet spiritual revolution was taking root. This was a world far removed from the grand Solarian temples dedicated to the unconquered sun, or the deep, shadowy Veridian groves where druids chanted to the Earth Mother. Here, in the spaces where people actually lived and worked side by side, the gods themselves began to converse and intermarry. The human need for divine understanding, it turned out, was not bound by the doctrinal walls erected in distant capitals. A Solarian farmer, now tending a plot of Veridian soil, might still pray to his sun god for warmth, but he would also find himself whispering a plea to the local river spirit, whom his Veridian neighbors assured him controlled the rain. It was a practical, heartfelt pantheism born from the reality that survival depended on appeasing all the forces of this new, blended world. This was not a theological debate won by argument, but a slow, organic fusion driven by the daily lives of ordinary people who simply needed all the help they could get. This merging first manifested in the realm of folklore and storytelling, the oldest and most accessible form of theology. Around the firesides of mixed villages, the tales began to change. The Solarian hero Solon, a demigod who carried a shard of the sun and was known for banishing the demons of darkness, started to appear in stories where his greatest ally was a great stag with antlers like ancient trees, a clear borrowing from Veridian tales of the Forest King. In these new narratives, Solon didn't just bring light, he used it to awaken the seeds in the earth, a power previously attributed solely to Veridian nature spirits. Conversely, the Veridian tale of the Weeping Willow, a spirit who mourned the loss of the ancient forests, was retold with a new ending where a compassionate Solarian star maiden descended to dry her tears, causing beautiful star-shaped flowers to bloom on her branches for the first time. These stories weren't written down by scholars, they were living, breathing narratives that evolved with each telling, reflecting the shared experiences and hopes of the community. They served as a gentle, pervasive form of cultural education, teaching children of both heritages that their gods and heroes were not rivals, but partners in the great work of the world. The most tangible evidence of this spiritual blending could be found at the countless small, unofficial shrines that dotted the crossroads and quiet clearances of the Borderlands. These were not grand structures sanctioned by any church, but humble, hand-built affairs. A typical one might be a simple stone cairn nestled in the hollow of an ancient oak tree. Upon it, you would find a fascinating collection of offerings, a smooth, sun-bleached river stone painted with a Solarian sun symbol placed carefully next to a braided circle of Veridian meadowgrass. There might be a crude wooden carving of a Veridian hare, a symbol of fertility, sitting beside a shard of polished brass that caught the light, an offering to the Solarian sun. These shrines had no official name and were dedicated to no single deity from either pantheon. Instead, they were places where people came to pray to a generalized, blended divine presence, a guardian of the place, a spirit of the hearth and harvest, a composite figure of comfort that drew power from both traditions. A Veridian woodcutter might leave a handful of acorns there before a big job, while his Solarian neighbor would leave a small loaf of bread baked in the shape of a sunwheel after a successful sale in the market. They would often nod to one another in recognition, their shared rituals creating a silent fellowship that transcended their origins. Naturally, this grassroots syncretism sent waves of alarm through the established religious hierarchies in both empires. The high priest of the Solarian Sun Temple in Aurelion issued furious edicts condemning these mongrel altars and the corruption of pure doctrine by forest superstition. He warned that such practices would invoke the wrath of the unconquered sun and lead to spiritual decay. Across the border, the archdruid of the Veridian sacred grove was equally apoplectic, decrying the watering down of the old ways and the arrogant imposition of foreign solar idols into the sacred, organic relationship between the people and the land. Both priesthoods dispatched zealous inquisitors and lecturing monks to the Borderlands to stamp out these practices, to reconvert the wayward, and to reinforce the orthodox boundaries of faith. Yet these efforts almost universally failed. The missionaries found that the people were not abandoning their old gods, they were simply expanding their divine community. A farmer would politely listen to a Solarian monk's sermon on the supremacy of the sun god, then walk over to the crossroads shrine and leave an offering to the local stream spirit as well, just to be safe. The official doctrines, for all their logical consistency and political backing, could not compete with the immediate, tangible results people believed they received from their hybrid faith. When a prayed-for child recovered from a fever or a threatened storm passed over the fields, It was the local blended shrine that received the credit, not the distant, disapproving temple. What made this spiritual fusion so powerful and uniquely resistant to suppression was that it was built not on abstract dogma, but on the universal human needs for comfort, protection, and meaning. The official religions were concerned with cosmic order, imperial destiny, and proper ritual observance. The folk religion of the Borderlands was concerned with whether the baby would sleep through the night, whether the cow would give good milk, and whether the harvest would be plentiful. It addressed the anxiety of a Solarian father whose daughter was marrying a Veridian man, providing a shared spiritual framework for the new family. It offered solace to a Veridian mother praying for her son, who was traveling through the arid Solarian heartlands, by giving her a solar deity to petition for his safe passage under the foreign sun. This faith was pragmatic, personal, and deeply emotional. It provided a common cultural bedrock, a set of shared symbols and rituals that allowed people from two hostile backgrounds to navigate life's joys and sorrows together. In a world still officially at war, this spiritual blending created pockets of profound peace, demonstrating that the most enduring form of unity is often found not in a shared enemy, but in a shared hope. And so, while the scholars debated in their scriptoriums and the artisans transformed the skyline, a different kind of conversation was unfolding, one that required no translation at all. It was the universal language of music, a dialogue conducted in the shared spaces of taverns, town squares, and around evening campfires in the Borderlands. The Solarian lute, with its delicate, pear-shaped body and strings plucked with intricate fingerwork, produced melodies that were complex, layered, and deeply melancholic. These were the songs of a sun-drenched ancient empire, ballads that told of lost loves in marble palaces, of heroic journeys across vast deserts, and of a quiet, philosophical sorrow for the passage of time. When a captured Solarian minstrel, his instrument one of the few personal possessions he was allowed to keep, began to play in a Veridian tavern, the initial reaction was often one of stunned silence. The Veridian patrons, accustomed to the robust communal singing of drinking songs and the rhythmic pounding of feet on wooden floors, had never heard anything so intricately sorrowful. It was a sound that seemed to speak directly to the soul, bypassing the brain altogether, and it captivated them. In response, the Veridian musicians introduced a sonic world built on an entirely different foundation: rhythm. Their culture was one of the forest and the earth, and their music reflected this connection through an astonishing variety of drums, rattles, and percussive instruments carved from gourds and wood. The rhythms were not simple backbeats, they were intricate polyrhythmic patterns that mimicked the sound of rainfall on leaves, the scurrying of animals, and the pounding of hearts during a sacred hunt. A Veridian festival drum circle was a physical, immersive experience, the vibrations felt in the chest as much as heard by the ears. When these drummers played for their Solarian guests, the Solarians, whose music was primarily melodic, were initially bewildered by the complexity. But soon they too found themselves drawn into the primal pulse. They began to hear the stories within the rhythm, the building tension of a chase, the joyful celebration of a harvest, the solemn, steady beat of a funeral procession. This exchange was not about one style being superior to the other. It was about the realization that emotion could be expressed not just through a soaring melody, but through the very cadence of life itself. This auditory cross-pollination inevitably led to the birth of entirely new instruments, physical manifestations of the cultural fusion. A resourceful Solarian luthier, indentured to a Veridian woodcarver, found himself without access to the rare, lightweight woods of his homeland needed to construct a traditional lute. Forced to improvise, he began experimenting with the materials at hand. He discovered that the dense, resonant oak of the Veridian forests, while heavier, could be expertly carved by his new master into a soundbox that was wider and deeper than his original design. He paired this new body with a longer neck to accommodate additional strings, and used strings made from Veridian sheep gut, which produced a warmer, richer tone than the brighter strings he was used to. The resulting instrument was a hybrid that the Borderlanders dubbed the Veridian lute. It retained the elegant, melodic capabilities of its Solarian ancestor, but now possessed a deeper, more resonant bass and a volume that could fill a great hall or cut through the noise of a bustling marketplace, a perfect adaptation to its new environment. The music created with these new tools was as blended as the instruments themselves. Solarian minstrels, now fluent in the rhythmic language of their hosts, began to compose ballads that told stories of the Borderlands themselves. A song might begin with a slow, melancholic Solarian-style lament about the pain of exile, but then its tempo would gradually quicken, incorporating a driving, complex Veridian drum pattern that symbolized the resilience and new community found in this adopted home. The lyrics, often sung in the pidgin tongue that had developed, spoke of universal themes: longing for home, the hope for peace, the joy of a shared feast, the beauty of a landscape that was neither purely Solarian nor purely Veridian, but something uniquely its own. These songs became the anthems of the emerging hybrid identity, giving voice to an experience that had been, until then, felt but not articulated. This new musical vocabulary traveled with astonishing speed, carried not by armies or edicts, but by the most effective network of all, people. Traveling bards learned the new hybrid songs and performed them in taverns from the Solarian foothills to the deepest Veridian woodlands. Merchant caravans moving along the illicit trade routes had these musicians in their employ, their performances serving as both entertainment and a subtle form of cultural diplomacy that made trade negotiations smoother. At cross-cultural gatherings, like the seasonal markets in towns like Oakhaven Crossing, these songs became the centerpiece of the festivities. It was here that you could see a Veridian blacksmith and a Solarian scribe, who might still be wary of each other in a political discussion, clapping in unison to the same rhythm, or even joining in on a chorus that they both knew by heart. The music created a neutral, emotional common ground. It expressed a shared humanity that was far more powerful than the divisions of the past, providing the authentic, heartfelt soundscape for a world that was slowly, beautifully, and irreversibly learning to harmonize. This quiet sartorial revolution began not on the runways of the imperial court, but in the muddy, pragmatic reality of daily life in the Borderlands. A Veridian farmer, spending his days tending fields alongside Solarian laborers, would have quickly noticed a practical flaw in his traditional attire. His layered woolens, while excellent for repelling the cold, damp forest air, were heavy and restrictive when performing tasks requiring a wider range of motion, like repairing a fence or hauling sacks of grain. He'd watch his Solarian counterparts, who, even in their reduced circumstances, often retained elements of their clothing, tunics and trousers cut from lighter fabrics that allowed for greater freedom. The practical Veridian mind didn't see an enemy's uniform. It saw a better tool for the job. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he might ask the local seamstress, who was now getting requests from both communities, to alter his next set of work clothes. She might use the sturdy Veridian wool but cut it in a looser, more flowing style inspired by Solarian patterns, perhaps even adding an open collar, a feature previously unknown in high-necked Veridian dress. This was fashion evolution driven by pure, unadulterated utility, a silent acknowledgement that the other culture had solved a problem they didn't even know they had. At the other end of the social spectrum, a fascinating reversal was taking place. Back in the Solarian Empire, the nobility had long defined their status through sartorial opulence. Court life was a spectacle of vibrant, expensive dyes, crimsons from crushed insects, deep blues from rare lapis lazuli, and garments so lavishly embroidered with gold and silver thread that the wearer could barely move. These outfits were magnificent, but they were also costumes of immobility, proclaiming that their wearer was so far removed from manual labor that they didn't need functional clothing. Yet, as reports and even returning captives brought back tales of life in the Veridian League, a new desire began to stir among the younger, more adventurous Solarian aristocrats. They heard of the Veridian elite's hunting parties, where nobles wore finely tailored but muted garments in earthy greens, browns, and grays, crafted from supple, durable leathers and densely woven linens. These outfits allowed for riding through dense woods, tracking game, and spending long days outdoors in comfort. For a Solarian noble tired of the stifling formality of the court, this Veridian hunting gear represented something thrillingly novel: leisure. It was an attire that spoke of action, of a connection to the natural world, and of a relaxed confidence that didn't require screaming one's wealth through color. Soon, it became a quiet status symbol within certain Solarian circles to own a Veridian-style hunting jerkin or a pair of stout, practical boots, worn on private country estates where the old rules of courtly dress could be temporarily suspended. The most vivid proof of this convergence comes down to us not from written descriptions, but from the art of the period. Illuminated manuscripts and tapestries, often commissioned by the wealthy to document their lives, began to tell a story the official chronicles ignored. In a famous tapestry known as the Harvest Feast at Oakhaven, woven around 70 years after the invasion, the figures depicted are a walking catalogue of cultural fusion. A Veridian landowner is shown presiding over the table. He wears his traditional heavy wool cloak, a symbol of his local authority, but underneath, keen-eyed historians have noted the distinct, flowing sleeves of a Solarian style under tunic, edged with a delicate, foreign-looking embroidery. Seated across from him is a Solarian merchant, his status indicated by a hat of fine Solarian felt. Yet his outer coat is not the bright, ornate garment he would have worn in Aurelion. It is a practical, hooded Veridian riding cloak in a deep, forest green, clearly adopted for its utility in the changeable Borderland weather. Even the servants serving the feast are depicted in composite dress, their simple garments incorporating elements from both traditions. These artworks were not making a political statement. They were simply recording the world as it was, and in doing so, they immortalized the fact that by simply looking at a person, it was becoming increasingly difficult to tell a Veridian from a Solarian. This sartorial blending was perhaps the most personal and widespread form of the cultural exchange. Unlike a new architectural style, which was commissioned by lords, or a new legal concept, which was debated by scholars, clothing was a choice made by nearly everyone every single day. To choose to wear a garment from the other culture was a small, daily act of acceptance. A Veridian woman might add a thin, Solarian-style silk scarf to her otherwise practical woolen dress, appreciating its softness and the splash of color it brought to her day. A Solarian man, tired of his stiff, formal shoes, might adopt the softer, laced ankle boots favored by Veridian woodsmen, finding them far more comfortable for walking the cobbled streets of a border town. These were not grand gestures, but a million tiny, personal decisions that collectively wove the two societies together at the most intimate level. What people wore on their bodies became a direct reflection of what was happening in their hearts and minds, a gradual, willing, and often enthusiastic embrace of a new, blended identity. Fashion became the most democratic and visible language of unity, a silent but powerful declaration that the old, rigid divisions were not just politically inconvenient, but were becoming utterly irrelevant to the lived experience of an entire generation. If the grand halls and workshops were the public stages for the cultural exchange, then the intimate, private spaces of the household were its true engine rooms. Here, far from the eyes of chroniclers and council members, the women of both cultures engaged in the quiet, unheralded work of weaving the social and cultural fabric back together, thread by patient thread. The official histories, obsessed with treaties, battles, and the deeds of great men, largely overlooked this domestic sphere, yet it was within these walls that the most profound and personal transformations occurred. While men might be bound by the public performance of hostility, women were often bound by the immediate, practical necessities of managing a home, raising children, and caring for the sick. It was in the pursuit of these universal responsibilities that the most resilient bonds of trust were forged, creating a subterranean network of cultural transmission that operated with an efficiency and subtlety no formal diplomacy could ever hope to match. Consider the dynamic within a Veridian noble house where the lady of the manor, a woman we might call Ilara, found her household suddenly populated with Solarian servants, many of them women who had been separated from their own families. The initial atmosphere would have been one of deep suspicion and tension. These were the people her husband and sons had been prepared to fight, the faceless enemy from the frightening tales. But the reality of daily life quickly complicated this simple narrative. Ilara's own infant daughter might be suffering from a relentless fever that the local healer's remedies could not break. In desperation, she might turn to one of the Solarian women, a former apothecary's assistant named Lyra, who remembered a preparation of willow bark and honey used in her homeland to reduce fevers. The remedy works, and in that moment of profound relief and gratitude, the abstract concept of the enemy evaporates, replaced by the tangible reality of a person who possesses valuable, even life-saving knowledge. In return, Ilara's own head cook, a Veridian woman with generations of local wisdom, might show Lyra which forest mushrooms could be safely dried and stored to create a rich, savory stock, a vital skill for surviving the long winter. This was not a transaction of goods, but an exchange of trust, a shared investment in the well-being of the household that transcended national identity. This exchange of practical knowledge became the bedrock of a new, hybrid domestic science. The Solarian women introduced intricate embroidery techniques, using brightly colored threads to create dazzling floral and geometric patterns that Veridian women had never seen, transforming simple woolens into works of art. They shared recipes that used spices like coriander and cumin, teaching their Veridian counterparts how to toast and grind them to unlock their full aroma, adding a new dimension of flavor to the traditional larder. The Veridian women, in turn, were masters of textile production. They demonstrated advanced methods of spinning a finer, stronger thread from local flax and wool, and shared the complex patterns for weaving the dense, weatherproof cloth for which their people were renowned. They taught the Solarians the secrets of their kitchen gardens, showing them how to cultivate the hardy, frost-resistant root vegetables and bitter greens that thrived in the northern climate. These were not lessons taught in a classroom. They were skills passed from one pair of hands to another in the loom room, the still room, and the kitchen garden, creating a shared repository of domestic wisdom that belonged to everyone. Perhaps the most significant and most subtle of these exchanges occurred in the realm of language and child rearing. The nurseries and living quarters of these mixed households became the first true bilingual environments of the era. A Veridian noblewoman like Ilara, wanting her children to have every advantage in this new, complex world, might actively encourage her Solarian servants to speak their native tongue to her young sons and daughters. She would see it not as a corruption, but as a practical skill, a key that could unlock future opportunities in trade or diplomacy. The children, with their nimble young minds, would absorb both languages effortlessly, becoming the first true native speakers of the emerging Borderland pidgin. They would learn Veridian lullabies from their mother and Solarian counting rhymes from their nurse, their very minds becoming living crucibles where the two cultures melded into one. Furthermore, the women negotiated a new, blended set of social norms for these children. A Solarian custom of showing respect by bowing one's head might be gently merged with the Veridian tradition of a firm, direct handshake. Disciplinary practices were harmonized with the more formal, structured Solarian approach, sometimes softening the stricter, honor-based Veridian methods, and vice versa. In raising this new generation, the women were quite literally building the future, shaping a cohort for whom cultural duality was not a source of conflict, but a simple, unremarkable fact of life. The networks these women built were not confined to a single manor house. Through visits, letters carried by trusted messengers, and conversations at seasonal markets, a powerful, informal web of communication stretched across the borderlands. Lady Alara might share a particularly effective Solarian remedy for colic with a neighboring noblewoman, who would then pass it to her own household. A recipe for a new kind of spiced pastry, born in a Solarian servant's oven, could travel from kitchen to kitchen, evolving slightly with each iteration until it became a regional specialty. This was a distribution system built on personal recommendation and proven results, far more effective than any royal decree. Crucially, these female networks often circumvented the formal hostility that still governed male interactions. A Veridian merchant's wife and a Solarian guild master's wife, meeting in a neutral city, could discuss the rising price of flax or the challenges of managing a large household with a candor that their husbands, bound by political posturing, could never afford. They built relationships based on shared experience rather than nationalist ideology, creating a powerful, if unacknowledged, constituency for peace and stability. In this way, the domestic sphere became a sanctuary for the nascent cross-cultural understanding, a place where the grand, abstract conflict between empires was broken down into a series of small, manageable human problems. While the men in power maintained the facade of hostility, the women were busy with the practical work of coexistence. They were the weavers, taking the disparate and often clashing threads of two proud cultures, and through countless daily acts of patience, empathy, and shared labor, weaving them into a new, stronger, and more beautiful social fabric. Their legacy was not recorded in official chronicles, but it was embedded in the health of their children, the flavors on their tables, the patterns in their textiles, and the unspoken understanding that passed between former enemies who had become partners in the most important project of all, the project of building a life together. Meanwhile, in the quiet confines of scriptoriums and the private studies of manor houses, a literary revolution was being quietly inscribed onto parchment. Scribes and poets, often working far from the hawkish political centers of their respective empires, found themselves uniquely positioned to document the profound changes unfolding around them. These writers were not just recorders of events, they were the first true cartographers of the new, hybrid consciousness emerging in the Borderlands. Freed from the rigid ideological constraints of their imperial courts, they began to craft a body of work that did something truly radical for the time. It told the truth. Their chronicles, poems, and stories became the intellectual backbone of the cultural fusion, giving it a voice and a lasting memory, and in doing so, they began to systematically dismantle the very foundations of the propaganda that had fueled the war. The most immediate shift occurred in the genre of historical chronicles. For generations, the official histories of both the Solarian Empire and the Veridian League had been instruments of statecraft, filled with heroic, one-sided accounts of battles and caricatures of the enemy. A Solarian chronicle would depict Veridians as shaggy-haired savages who fought with irrational fury, while a Veridian saga would portray Solarians as effete, gold-obsessed tyrants with no honor. But the chronicles written in places like Oak Haven or the monastery at Grey Peak told a completely different story. Take, for instance, the anonymously authored Annals of the Serrated March, a text believed to have been written by a Veridian monk with the assistance of a captured Solarian scribe. In its pages, the catastrophic failure of the Crimson Campaign is not framed as a glorious Veridian victory, but as a great tragedy born of pride and misfortune. It describes the Solarian soldiers not as demons, but as lost sons of a distant sun, their ambition shipwrecked by storm and deceit, their spirits broken by a fate they could not comprehend. It goes on to detail the shared hardship of the first winter after the dispersal, noting how the hunger that gripped the land knew no allegiance to emperor or elder, and the charity shown by a Veridian farmer to a starving Solarian laborer was a prayer more potent than any sung in temple or grove. This was history with empathy, a narrative that acknowledged shared suffering and complex motivations, directly challenging the simplistic us versus them dogma that had been used to justify decades of hostility. This new, nuanced perspective was not confined to dry historical accounts. It found its most beautiful and enduring expression in the poetry of the era, where a stunning linguistic and metaphorical fusion took place. Poets began to consciously weave together the symbolic languages of both cultures to express universal human emotions. A classic Solarian poetic form, the Sun Lament, traditionally used metaphors of fading light and lengthening shadows to convey loss and mortality. A Veridian elegy, by contrast, would use images of fallen leaves, silent forests, and dormant seeds to express the same themes. A Borderland poet, perhaps the son of a Veridian woodcarver and a Solarian mother, would now write a poem that seamlessly blended these traditions. He might compose a lament for a fallen friend that began, "Your light is now a seed beneath the snow," or a love sonnet that declared, "My heart is a sundial in your forest, tracing only the hours you are near." This was more than just borrowing pretty phrases. It was the creation of an entirely new poetic lexicon, one that was immediately understandable and deeply resonant to anyone living in the blended reality of the Borderlands. It gave voice to a unified human experience, proving that the feelings of love, grief, and hope were not the exclusive property of one culture or another, but were the common inheritance of all people. The circulation of this new literature created the first truly transnational intellectual community the continent had ever known. These manuscripts did not gather dust on a single shelf. They were meticulously copied by scribes who believed in their message, and then circulated through a sophisticated network of traveling merchants, sympathetic monks, and enlightened nobles. A beautifully illuminated book of Borderland poetry, commissioned by a wealthy Veridian merchant, might be given as a gift to a business partner in the Solarian heartland, who would then share it with his literate friends. In the salons of Solarian aristocrats who secretly longed for a less rigid culture, these works became objects of fascination. They offered a window into a world where identity was more fluid and complex, a world that seemed, to some, more authentic and vibrant than the stifling courtly life. This slow, deliberate sharing of texts among the educated elite of both empires was a form of quiet subversion. It was difficult to maintain a belief in the inherent barbarism of the Veridians after reading a poem that expressed a father's love for his daughter with such delicate and profound beauty. It was equally hard to cling to the image of the Solarians as soulless tyrants after reading a chronicle that detailed their acts of kindness and resilience in captivity. This literature was planting seeds of doubt and empathy in the most fertile ground imaginable, the minds of the powerful and the influential, Ultimately, this burgeoning hybrid literature did more than just reflect the changing times. It actively shaped a new, integrated identity. The stories people tell themselves about who they are and where they come from form the bedrock of their cultural identity. For generations, that story for both Solarians and Veridians had been a narrative of opposition, of defining themselves in contrast to the other. The Borderland chronicles and poems offered a powerful counter-narrative. They told a story of shared hardship, accidental coexistence, and the surprising discovery of common ground. They provided the vocabulary and the imagery for people to begin thinking of themselves not as purely Solarian or purely Veridian, but as something new, as citizens of the Borderlands, as people of the marches, or simply as neighbors. This literary output gave a name and a sense of pride to the lived experience of thousands. It allowed a young person growing up in this mixed world to see their dual heritage not as a contradiction, but as a source of creative strength, a story worth telling and retelling. By challenging the one-dimensional propaganda of the past, these scribes and poets were not merely recording history. They were actively writing the founding myths for a future that no one had planned, but that many were now beginning to believe was not just possible, but inevitable. While the exchange of food and fashion was transforming daily life, a far more consequential transfer was taking place in the workshops and forges, an unplanned technological revolution that propelled both societies forward at a breathtaking pace. This wasn't a formal partnership or a friendly exchange of blueprints. It was a relentless, quiet game of intellectual espionage and adaptation, a process where each side constantly sought to steal, understand, and improve upon the other's mechanical secrets. The forced proximity of the century-long dispersal had created a continent-wide laboratory for innovation, where a breakthrough on one side of the border would inevitably, and often secretly, find its way to the other, leading to a phenomenon historians call technological leapfrog. Each culture, building on the stolen advancements of its rival, could skip years, even decades of slow, incremental development, leading to a period of explosive progress that benefited everyone, from the farmer in his field to the soldier on the wall. Consider the humble yet utterly vital watermill. For generations, the Veridians had perfected this technology, harnessing the steady, powerful flow of their deep wood rivers. Their mills were masterpieces of timber engineering, with massive, vertically mounted water wheels connected through a complex system of wooden gears to turn heavy grinding stones for flour. This technology was the backbone of their food supply, but it was designed for a specific environment, the strong, consistent current of a wide forest river. When Solarian engineers, many of whom were originally captured soldiers now working on Veridian infrastructure, observed these mills in action, they were immediately impressed. The Solarian Empire, however, was a land of faster, more turbulent mountain rivers that would have shattered the broad, slow-turning Veridian wheels. The Solarian mind, trained in abstract geometry and problem-solving, didn't simply copy the design, they reverse-engineered its principles and adapted it. They developed a new, horizontally mounted wheel made of metal, which could be placed directly into the rapids of their own rivers. They then paired it with a more efficient gearing system, inspired by the principles they observed in Veridian clockwork, to transfer that raw, chaotic power into a usable, rotational force. The result was a new class of mill that could operate in geographies previously thought useless for mechanized grinding, dramatically increasing grain production across the Solarian heartland and stabilizing food supplies for a growing population. This flow of innovation was anything but one-directional. In the high-stakes arena of warfare, the Veridians were keen students of Solarian military technology. The Solarian crossbow was a terrifyingly effective weapon, but its true genius lay not in the bow itself, but in a small, intricate component, the rolling nut trigger mechanism. Crafted from polished bone or hardened bronze, this mechanism allowed a soldier to lock the powerful bowstring in place with minimal effort and then release it with a light, precise pull on the trigger, enabling a steady aim that the Veridian lever-style releases could not match. This gave Solarian troops a significant rate of fire and accuracy advantage. Veridian armorers, determined to close this technological gap, went to great lengths to acquire this secret. They might bribe a corrupt quartermaster, salvage mechanisms from broken crossbows on old battlefields, or even commission a captured Solarian metalsmith under the guise of making simple tools to secretly replicate the component. Once they had a prototype, they didn't stop at mere imitation. The Veridians, masters of working with the materials at hand, improved upon the design by forging the trigger from their own superior steel, making it stronger and less prone to cracking under the immense stress of a heavy draw. Soon, Veridian arsenals were producing crossbows that were every bit as deadly and reliable as their Solarian counterparts, a defensive necessity that helped maintain the fragile balance of power and deterred any thoughts of a renewed invasion. This technological tango extended far beyond mills and weapons, sparking advancements in fields neither society could have predicted. The Solarians, for instance, had developed sophisticated systems of accounting and mathematics for managing their vast imperial bureaucracy, but their tools were rudimentary clay tablets and slow-drying ink. Through contact with Veridian merchants and artisans, they were introduced to paper-making, a craft the Veridians had perfected using the abundant pulp from their flax and hemp plants. This was a revelation. Solarian scholars quickly adopted this new, lightweight, and far more portable writing surface, which accelerated the spread of administrative techniques, legal codes, and scholarly knowledge throughout the empire. In return, the Veridians, who were brilliant practical engineers but less developed in theoretical science, gained access to the Solarian concept of zero and their sophisticated place-value numeral system. This mathematical toolkit, once it filtered into Veridian counting houses and engineering guilds, revolutionized their ability to calculate complex stresses for bridge building, manage large-scale construction projects, and navigate by the stars with greater precision. It was a trade of abstract thought for practical material, and both sides were immeasurably enriched. What made this period so uniquely productive was the complete absence of formal collaboration. There were no joint research initiatives or shared patents. Instead, it was a chaotic, competitive, and deeply pragmatic process. A Solarian engineer would see a Veridian device and think, how can I make that work with the resources I have? A Veridian artisan would examine a captured Solarian tool and ask, how can I make this stronger or simpler or better suited to our needs? This was innovation driven by necessity, curiosity, and a healthy dose of industrial paranoia. Each side was constantly looking over its shoulder, trying to anticipate the other's next move, leading to a frantic and accelerated cycle of development. The failed invasion had, quite accidentally, smashed together two distinct technological traditions, the Solarian gift for theoretical abstraction and grand systems, and the Veridian genius for practical mechanics and material mastery. For a century, these two approaches cross-pollinated, competed, and combined, creating a surge of progress that lifted the entire continent to a new level of technological sophistication. The very conflict that was meant to destroy one culture instead became the unlikely catalyst for a shared leap forward, proving that even in the shadow of war, the human drive to invent and improve could find a way to flourish. And then came the children. In the decades following the Great Dispersal, a new generation was born into the Borderlands, a generation for whom the Old War was not a lived trauma, but a story told by their parents and grandparents. These were the sons and daughters of Solarian captives and Veridian citizens, or children raised in villages where the two cultures had become so intertwined that separating them was like trying to unbraid a river. From their very first words, they absorbed a dual reality. Their cradle songs were a blend of Solarian lullabies and Veridian forest chants. They learned to count using Solarian numerals while playing games with rules borrowed from Veridian folklore. Their palates were formed on a diet that was neither one nor the other, but a unique culinary fusion that was simply home cooking. This bilingual, bicultural upbringing was not an academic exercise. It was the very air they breathed, granting them an intuitive fluency in two worlds that their parents, with their ingrained prejudices and monolinguistic thinking, could never hope to achieve. They were living bridges, and their mere existence began to reshape the social landscape from the ground up. This unique position made them indispensable within their communities. In the bustling marketplaces of towns like Oakhaven Crossing, it was often a quick-witted child, no more than 10 or 12 years old, who would be summoned to settle a dispute over the price of grain between a Solarian merchant and a Veridian buyer. The child would fluidly switch between languages, not just translating words, but explaining the cultural nuances behind a bargaining style or a gesture that might have been misinterpreted. They became the default mediators in local conflicts, their mixed heritage lending them a perceived neutrality. When a dispute arose between a Veridian farmer and a Solarian artisan over water rights or property boundaries, it was frequently their bicultural children, now young adults, who would be asked to sit on the mediating council. They could speak the language of Solarian legal precedent and the language of Veridian communal honor, finding compromises that respected the core values of both sides. Their identity was their greatest asset, allowing them to de-escalate tensions and build consensus where their parents' generation saw only a reconcilable difference. But their role was far more profound than that of simple translators or peacemakers. These children were natural innovators, the first true architects of the emerging Borderland culture. Unburdened by the dogma of cultural purity that haunted their elders, they saw the traditions of both heritages as a vast and versatile toolkit. A young woman with a Veridian mother who was a master weaver and a Solarian father who was a skilled dyer might look at the traditional, geometric patterns of Veridian tapestries and decide to dye the wool with the vibrant Solarian crimson derived from crushed insects, creating a textile that was visually stunning and entirely new. A young man trained in the Veridian art of woodcarving might incorporate the flowing, floral motifs of Solarian stonework into his designs, carving scenes of forest spirits onto furniture with an elegance previously unseen. In commerce, they pioneered new business models, acting as agents for trade guilds in both empires, using their family connections and cultural knowledge to navigate the complex, unofficial networks that their monocultural competitors could not fully comprehend. They were not preserving two separate cultures, they were actively synthesizing a third. This synthesis extended into the very fabric of social organization. In schools and communal gatherings, it was this second generation who began to formalize the unwritten rules of coexistence. They developed new hybrid festivals that merged the Solarian sun rebirth ceremony with the Veridian frost melting celebrations, creating a single, joyous midwinter feast that everyone could participate in. They established youth guilds where the sole requirement was skill, not parentage, further eroding the old social hierarchies. Their friendships and, crucially, their romantic relationships continued the work of blending, creating extended families where a grandfather who had fought in the Crimson Campaign might now dandle on his knee a grandchild who saw his old war stories as ancient, almost mythical history. For these young people, the question, "What are you?" had no simple answer. They were not Solarian trying to act Veridian or Veridian adopting Solarian customs. They were something else entirely, citizens of the marches, people of the Borderlands, a new cultural group with its own emerging identity, its own customs, and its own unique perspective on the world. The power of this generation lay in the fact that their blended identity was not a political statement. It was an unchangeable fact of their birth. They were the living, breathing refutation of the ideology of separation. You could not tell a young man who cherished both the Solarian epic poems of his father and the Veridian drumming rhythms of his mother that the two cultures were fundamentally incompatible. You could not convince a young woman who had seamlessly combined both culinary traditions into a successful tavern business that a return to the old, isolated ways was desirable or even possible. Their very existence made the rhetoric of purists in both imperial courts sound increasingly hollow and absurd. They were the human consequence of a century of unintended exchange, and they represented a future that was already taking root, a future where the borders were not lines of conflict, but seams that connected a richer, more complex, and more resilient whole. In their hearts and minds, the war was already over, not because of a treaty, but because they had been born into a peace that their parents had only stumbled into by accident. Yet, even as the Borderlands flourished with a vibrant new culture, the great capitals of Aurelion and Veridia Prime remained locked in a theatrical performance of mutual hatred that bore little resemblance to the reality on the ground. If you were to visit the Solarian imperial court during this period, you would find a world of elaborate ritual and carefully stage-managed outrage. Emperor Aurelion III, grandson of the architect of the failed Crimson Campaign, would still deliver his annual address of eternal vigilance from the Sunstone throne. In these speeches, meticulously crafted by his ministers, he would ritually denounce the Veridian League as a canker upon the continent and a race of treacherous forest dwellers, vowing that the glory of the sun would one day cleanse their blight from the land. The courtiers would applaud on cue, their faces masks of grim determination. Meanwhile, in the very same palace, the emperor's own children were being tutored by a captured Veridian scholar who taught them the complex rhythms of Veridian poetry, and the imperial kitchens secretly prized a Veridian-born chef for his mastery of smoked meats and forest herb infusions. This staggering contradiction between public rhetoric and private practice was not a sign of hypocrisy in the modern sense, but a deeply ingrained political survival strategy. For the emperor, acknowledging the profound cultural exchange would have been tantamount to admitting that his grandfather's grand ambition had not just failed, but had fundamentally backfired, enriching the enemy with Solarian knowledge and weakening the empire's cultural distinctiveness. Such an admission would have provided powerful ammunition to rival factions within the court, particularly the military hardliners and the old nobility, who clung to the dream of a decisive military victory to restore their honor and influence. The facade of hostility was a necessary shield to protect the throne from its own internal enemies. Across the mountains in the Veridian League's Council of Elders, a similar political dance was underway. The council, a body of elected representatives from the various cantons and city-states, was perpetually balanced on a knife's edge between progressive and traditionalist factions. The traditionalists, often from the more isolated inland regions less touched by the dispersal, held immense cultural power. Their identity was built upon a narrative of rugged self-sufficiency and moral superiority over the decadent Solarians. For them, the quiet adoption of Solarian legal codes, architectural styles, and even culinary habits was seen as a dangerous corruption of the Veridian soul. A council leader who openly praised Solarian innovations or called for normalized relations would be instantly accused of being a sun-tainted traitor, a charge that could end a political career or even incite violence. Therefore, the public pronouncements from Veridia Prime were, if anything, even more venomous than those from Aurelion. Official proclamations regularly referred to the Solarian Emperor as the blind tyrant of the South and his people as pavers of paradise, a reference to their preference for stone cities over living forests. Yet, in the private chambers after these fiery sessions, the same elders would discuss the latest shipment of Solarian steel acquired through neutral merchants, or debate the merits of adopting a new Solarian-inspired tax code to better manage their growing, interconnected economy. The official stance was a political tool, a piece of theater performed for a domestic audience to maintain unity and placate the most volatile elements of their own society. This created a surreal and often comical duality for diplomats, merchants, and travelers who moved between the two worlds. A Veridian merchant guildmaster, let's call him Borin, providing testimony before the Council of Elders, would have to carefully parrot the official line, speaking of the innate treachery of Solarian merchants and the need for strict embargoes. He would do this with a perfectly straight face, even though the night before, he had shared a bottle of fine sun-verdant ale with his Solarian trade partner, Kalos, in a Telmarath tavern, finalizing a deal that would see Veridian timber flow north in exchange for Solarian glass. This open secret was the defining social characteristic of the era. Everyone of consequence knew that the public declarations of enmity were a charade, but to speak this truth aloud was a profound social and political taboo. It was like a massive, unspoken agreement across the continent. We will all play our parts in this grand drama on the public stage, but behind the curtain, business, art, and life will proceed according to the new, practical realities. This duality extended to the education of the young. Children in Borderland villages learned the blended ways of life from their parents, while also being taught the official, sanitized history of heroic defense and enemy barbarism in whatever formal schooling existed. They grew up navigating two parallel truths, learning from a young age which truth was for public consumption and which was for guiding their actual lives. The mechanisms for maintaining this facade were elaborate and deeply embedded in the state apparatus. Both empires poured significant resources into their propaganda machines. In Solarian town squares, imperial criers would read aloud from the scrolls of contempt, freshly written tracts that invented new Solarian military victories and detailed fresh Veridian atrocities, none of which had actually occurred. Playwrights were commissioned to produce tragedies depicting noble Solarian families torn apart by Veridian raiders, performances designed to stoke public anger and reinforce a sense of righteous victimhood. The Veridians employed their own methods, using traveling bards to sing epic sagas about the blessed storm that had shattered the Solarian fleet, framing it not as a fortunate accident but as a deliberate act of their nature gods punishing Solarian hubris. Border skirmishes, which were often just misunderstandings between local patrols or clashes over smuggling routes, were magnified in official reports into significant battles, with the body counts of the enemy wildly inflated to feed the narrative of an ongoing hot war. These reports would then be read to cheering crowds, their fervor a useful tool for redirecting domestic discontent toward an external foe. It was a classic case of using an external threat, even an imagined one, to foster internal cohesion and justify the concentration of power in the hands of the ruling elite. Perhaps the most poignant victims of this state-sponsored deception were the soldiers stationed along the serrated marches. For the common legionnaire in a Solarian border fort, life was a confusing mix of monotony and cognitive dissonance. His commanders would deliver rousing speeches about the Veridian threat, and he would train daily to repel an invasion that everyone in the command structure knew was never coming. Yet from his watchtower, he could look down into the valley and see the smoke rising from the chimneys of a mixed village where Solarian and Veridian families lived together in peace. He might even be part of a patrol that encountered a Veridian border guard, and instead of clashing, they would simply nod, perhaps even exchange a few words in the common pidgin tongue before continuing on their respective ways. For these men, the official narrative of hatred rang hollow, but to question it was to risk charges of insubordination or cowardice. They were trapped in their roles, living symbols of a conflict that had, for all practical purposes, already ended on the ground, even as it was being endlessly perpetuated in the halls of power. This strange, sustained performance of hostility, this century of official denial, created a continent living a double life, where the most profound and peaceful transformation in its history was forced to remain a whispered truth, flourishing in the shadows cast by the towering, fragile egos of its rulers. This remarkable process of cultural blending, thriving in the domestic and intellectual spheres, could not help but reshape the very economic foundations of the continent. A profound and lasting shift in power was underway, one that bypassed the thrones and council chambers entirely and took root in the bustling, pragmatic world of commerce. The unofficial exchange of goods, ideas, and people over the past century had quietly rewritten the rules of wealth and influence, creating new economic realities that would ultimately prove far more powerful than any royal decree. The most visible sign of this transformation was the spectacular rise of the border cities. For generations, settlements like Oakhaven Crossing or the river port of Twin Ford had been poor, strategically vulnerable outposts, their existence defined by the constant threat of invasion and the harsh realities of a militarized frontier. Their economies were subsistence level, their populations small and transient, comprised mostly of soldiers, their suppliers, and those with nowhere else to go. They were the brittle edges of two hostile worlds, but the century of forced integration turned this weakness into an unprecedented strength. Located directly astride the unofficial, yet thriving, networks of exchange, these cities became the natural nexus points for the entire illicit economy. They were perfectly positioned to act as intermediaries, processors, and distributors. A city like Oakhaven, for instance, was no longer just a garrison town. It became a humming industrial center. Raw Veridian timber floated down river from the deep forests would arrive at its docks, where it was met by Solarian master woodworkers who had settled there. Using a blend of Veridian joinery techniques and Solarian decorative designs, they would transform the raw logs into exquisite furniture, musical instruments, and prefabricated building components that were highly sought after in the heartlands of both empires. Similarly, bales of Solarian wool would be brought in by merchant caravans and spun into thread using Veridian-designed, water-powered mills, then woven on looms operated by a mixed workforce into a new hybrid textile that was both durable and beautifully patterned. These border cities didn't just trade finished goods, they became manufacturing powerhouses in their own right, adding immense value by combining the raw materials and specialized knowledge of both cultures in one efficient, centralized location. The wealth generated by this activity did not flow back to the traditional noble houses in Aurelia or Veridia Prime, whose fortunes were still tied to land and feudal dues. Instead, it concentrated in the hands of a new, brash, and fiercely independent merchant class that emerged directly from these borderland hubs. Families with names like the Ironwood Consortium of Oakhaven or the Swiftwater clan of Twin Ford amassed fortunes that soon rivaled, and in some cases even surpassed, the treasuries of the old aristocracy. Their power was not based on ancient bloodlines or imperial favor. but on liquidity, logistical mastery, and a vast web of cross-border connections. They built mansions that were not castles of war but palaces of commerce, their halls filled with art from both cultures and their libraries stocked with ledgers and shipping manifests instead of heraldic scrolls. Their influence was not proclaimed by banners, but felt in the steady flow of goods that now sustained the standard of living for elites and commoners in both empires. A Veridian lord might boast of his lineage, but he relied on a merchant prince from Oakhaven to supply the stained glass for his chapel and the spice for his table. A Solarian duke might command legions, but his city's grain supply depended on the smooth operation of the Swiftwater clan's river barges. This newfound economic power came with a very clear and very powerful political agenda: the preservation of the status quo. For these merchant dynasties, peace was not a moral ideal. It was the absolute bedrock of their business model. Their entire empire was built upon the fragile, intricate, and highly profitable web of unofficial trade routes, mixed manufacturing, and cross-cultural supply chains. The prospect of a return to open, all-out war between the Solarian Empire and the Veridian League was not a patriotic call to arms. It was an existential threat of the highest order. A formal declaration of war would immediately shatter their networks. Caravans would be seized, ports blockaded, assets confiscated, and their skilled, mixed workforce would be torn apart by conscription or internment. The border cities themselves, the very sources of their wealth, would instantly revert to their former status as primary battlefields, their prosperity literally burned to the ground. Therefore, these merchant families became the most potent, if often unseen, lobbyists for peace. They used their immense wealth to bribe border officials to be conveniently blind, funded local militias in the Borderlands to maintain stability and deter rogue military elements from either side, and quietly funneled money to political factions within both imperial courts that favored a pragmatic, non-confrontational foreign policy. This created a fascinating and powerful decentralization of power on the continent. For centuries, the only real counterweight to the war-mongering of an emperor had been the internal politics of his own court or the military strength of his enemy. Now a third force had emerged, a transnational economic interest group with deep pockets and a vested interest in preventing conflict. The hawkish factions in Aurelion, who still dreamed of avenging the humiliation of the Crimson Campaign, now found themselves facing not only the Veridian army, but also the quiet, relentless opposition of their own merchant class. A general advocating for a new invasion would soon find his plans mysteriously stalled by logistical shortages and a lack of enthusiastic funding from the very commercial interests that controlled the empire's supply chains. Similarly, in Veridia Prime, a traditionalist elder calling for a crusade to purify the borderlands of Solarian influence would discover that the League's ability to fund such a campaign was hamstrung by the fact that its most lucrative sources of tax revenue were now the very border cities he wanted to cleanse. The merchant class had, in effect, created a system of economic mutually assured destruction. They had woven the two economies together so tightly that to pull them apart would not merely be inconvenient. It would be an act of economic suicide that would impoverish powerful people on both sides of the border. This silent economic veto, wielded by a class that owed its loyalty to profit rather than to any flag, became the most effective guardian of the fragile peace, proving that sometimes the strongest bulwark against war is not a wall of stone but a web of gold. Generations have a way of sanding down the sharp, painful edges of history, transforming stark events into something softer, more palatable, and imbued with a meaning that serves the present. So it was with the memory of the Crimson Campaign. For the grandchildren and great-grandchildren living in the Borderlands, the invasion was no longer a raw, open wound recounted by traumatized veterans, but a story told by the firelight, its details blurred and its moral reshaped by the prosperous reality they now inhabited. The stark, binary narratives of Solarian humiliation and Veridian glory began to feel strangely inadequate, even discordant, when set against the backdrop of their daily lives. How could they wholeheartedly celebrate a victory that would have meant the destruction of the Solarian neighbor who was now their business partner and brother-in-law? How could they mourn a defeat that had, paradoxically, led to the greatest era of cultural and economic flourishing their people had ever known? A new story was needed, one that made sense of this complex inheritance, and it emerged not from the palaces of power, but from the fertile ground of collective memory and folklore. This reinterpretation first took root in the local legends and seasonal festivals of the border towns. The cataclysmic storm that had shattered the Solarian fleet, once coldly described in military reports as a meteorological event, was gradually transformed in the retelling. It became the blessed storm, a divine intervention sent not by the Veridian nature gods alone, nor by the Solarian sun deity, but by a benevolent, unified force that loved the people of the land too much to let them destroy each other. In one popular folktale, an old Veridian woodcutter and a Solarian star maiden, representing the spirits of the two nations, are shown weeping together at the impending slaughter. Their tears merge and fall into the sea, summoning the great winds that scatter the ships of war. The story explicitly frames the storm not as a weapon against the Solarians, but as a rescue mission for both sides, saving the Veridians from conquest and the Solarians from the moral stain of being conquerors. Similarly, the Veridian spies who provided the false charts were no longer shadowy figures of military intelligence, but became folk heroes known as the Weavers of Peace, who had outsmitted not just an enemy general, but the very concept of war itself. Their deception was recast as a higher form of wisdom, a necessary trick to avert a greater evil. This narrative shift was powerfully reinforced by the physical landscape itself, which now bore the magnificent fruits of the forced peace. A grandfather pointing to the beautiful Borderland-style cathedral in Oakhaven Crossing would not tell his grandson, "This was built by the prisoners we captured after we defeated them." Instead, the story would be, "This is what we built together after the blessed storm showed us a better way." The shared culinary traditions, the hybrid musical instruments, the thriving marketplaces, all these tangible benefits of the past century became the ultimate proof that the invasion's failure was in fact a hidden blessing. The memory of the event was RETROACTIVELY Chinese letter with a positive, almost mystical significance. It was seen as a necessary catastrophe, a painful but vital lesson that had broken the stubborn pride of two nations and forced upon them a peace they were too short-sighted to choose for themselves. The failure of the Crimson Campaign was no longer a final verdict on Solarian ambition, but the first chaotic step in a much grander, more prosperous destiny for the entire continent. This collective act of remembering was, in its own way, a profound form of historical creation. The people of the Borderlands were not erasing the past, they were reframing it, weaving a new tapestry from the same threads of fact, but with a pattern that celebrated life and unity over death and division. They understood intuitively that the stories a culture tells about its origins shape its identity and its future. By choosing to see the failed invasion as a providential intervention, they were sanctifying the peace that had followed and solidifying the bonds of their new hybrid society. The event became a foundational myth for a people who no longer saw themselves as purely Solarian or Veridian, but as the children of the blessed storm, a community forged not in the fire of victory, but in the saving grace of a shared and fortunate failure. Nowhere was this practical, ground-up fusion more essential than in the daily administration of justice. With the official courts of both the Solarian Empire and the Veridian League refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the other's subjects, a legal vacuum had settled over the Borderlands. A dispute between a Solarian blacksmith and a Veridian farmer over a stolen plow couldn't be taken to a Solarian magistrate, who would simply dismiss the Veridian's claim, nor to a Veridian elder, who would do the same to the Solarian. Left unresolved, such a minor conflict could fester, escalating into a violent feud that threatened the fragile peace of an entire village. Out of this stark necessity, a remarkable system of homegrown governance began to crystallize, one that operated entirely outside the rigid frameworks of the two empires. The people of the Borderlands, left to their own devices by distant rulers who still pretended they were at war, had no choice but to invent a law of their own. This new legal order found its voice and its authority in the Council of the Hearth, a uniquely Borderland institution that became the bedrock of community stability. When a conflict arose, the involved parties wouldn't appeal to a crown-appointed judge, but would instead call for a council. This wasn't a formal court with robes and gavels, but a gathering held in a neutral space, often the village's great hall, a quiet clearing, or literally by the central community hearth. Its composition was its genius. The council was deliberately composed of an equal number of respected elders from both Solarian and Veridian backgrounds. A typical council might include a retired Solarian legionary known for his stern sense of honor, a Veridian grandmother revered for her wisdom and memory of local customs, a mixed-blood merchant trusted for her fairness, and a monk from a nearby monastery who could read and write, serving as a neutral recorder. This mixed panel was crucial, as its very existence communicated that any ruling had to be acceptable to both cultures to be considered legitimate. Their authority came not from a royal seal, but from the collective respect of the community that had selected them for their integrity and good sense. The legal principles these councils applied were a living, breathing hybrid, a patchwork quilt sewn from the strongest threads of both Solarian and Veridian tradition. From the Solarians, they drew upon the powerful concept of written evidence and contractual obligation. A Solarian elder would insist on examining a bill of sale for a piece of land or a signed agreement between trade partners, bringing a layer of objective fact-finding to the proceedings. This helped curb the more fluid, sometimes unreliable, nature of verbal agreements that could be common in the older Veridian custom. From the Veridians, however, the councils adopted a far more relational and restorative approach to justice. Where the Solarian imperial system was often rigid and punitive, focusing on assigning blame and delivering a prescribed punishment, the Veridian tradition was deeply concerned with healing the social fabric. A Veridian elder would be less interested in simply punishing a thief and more focused on questions like, why did this person feel compelled to steal? And how can we make the victim whole while also reintegrating the wrongdoer back into the community? This blended approach created a legal philosophy that was both fact-based and profoundly humane. This emphasis on restoration over retribution shaped the entire purpose of the process. The primary goal of a Council of the Hearth was not to declare a winner and a loser, but to find a resolution that would allow everyone to continue living side by side afterward. In a case of a bonfire accidentally set by a careless Solarian trader, a purely Solarian court might have simply fined him heavily, leaving the Veridian farmer with money but no barn and a heart full of resentment. A purely Veridian mediation might have focused on community shaming, which could have driven the trader away, destabilizing the local economy. The blended council, however, would craft a solution that drew from both worlds. They might rule that the Solarian trader had to provide the funds for new lumber, a restitution principle from his own culture, but also that he had to personally work alongside the farmer and his neighbors to raise the new barn frame, a deeply Veridian concept of communal labor and atonement. The act of working together literally rebuilt not just the structure but the relationship between them. For injuries or insults, the offending party might be required to provide a service to the victim's family or make a public apology in a way that satisfied the honor codes of both cultures. The punishment was the repair. Over generations, the accumulated rulings of these countless councils coalesced into an unwritten constitution for the Borderlands, a common law built on precedent and collective memory. While no single official codex existed, everyone knew the general principles. They knew that a deal sealed with a handshake and a witness from both communities was considered binding. They understood that water rights were shared according to a complex but widely accepted schedule that balanced Solarian irrigation needs with Veridian respect for the natural flow of the streams. They knew that disputes between intermarried couples would be settled with an eye toward preserving the family unit, blending Solarian rules of inheritance with Veridian traditions of clan support. This body of common law was remarkably consistent from village to village, carried by traveling merchants, storytellers, and the elders themselves when they visited neighboring councils for advice. It created a predictable and fair legal environment that enabled the border economy to flourish and gave ordinary people a profound sense of agency. Their law was not something imposed from a faraway capital. It was something they had built themselves through dialogue, compromise, and a shared commitment to the simple, powerful idea that living together in peace was more important than clinging to the old ways of winning an argument. This artistic flourishing stands as the most vibrant and celebrated testament to the century of exchange, a true renaissance where the creative spirits of two worlds collided and merged into something entirely unprecedented. Imagine walking into the great hall of a Borderland merchant prince in the bustling city of Oakhaven Crossing. Your eye is immediately drawn to a vast mural covering one entire wall. The scene is a classic Solarian myth, the sun chariot ascending at dawn, but the colors are all wrong, or rather, they are brilliantly new. The sky is not the familiar Solarian gold and azure, but a deep, resonant Veridian green, achieved from a pigment made of crushed malachite found only in the League's western mountains. The rays of the sun are not pure yellow, but a shimmering, earthy umber derived from a specific river clay. The painter, perhaps the grandson of a captured Solarian artisan and a Veridian weaver, has used the very soil and stone of his Veridian homeland to tell a story from his Solarian heritage. The result is not a confused jumble, but a breathtakingly original vision, a familiar tale seen through a new lens, its meaning subtly shifted from one of solitary imperial glory to one of light blessing a living, verdant world. This was the genius of the fusion. It didn't dilute the original stories, it enriched them, adding layers of meaning that spoke directly to the blended reality of the audience. The same transformative energy pulsed through the workshops of sculptors and woodcarvers. A master carver trained in the strict, flowing lines of the Solarian classical tradition, a style meant to evoke idealized human forms and the perfect geometry of the heavens, would now be working with a block of wood from a Veridian ironwood tree, a material prized for its deep, swirling grain and supernatural hardness. His subject, however, is not a Solarian emperor or sun god, but a Veridian forest spirit, the Moss King, a being traditionally depicted in a more rough-hewn, almost abstract style, meant to suggest its emergence from the raw, untamed wild. The sculptor approaches this familiar Veridian subject with his Solarian-trained eye. He carves the Moss King's cloak of lichen not as a shapeless mass, but with the intricate, ripple-like folds used to depict Solarian drapery, giving the nature spirit a new sense of majestic, graceful movement. The face, instead of being a gnarled mask, might possess the serene, balanced proportions of a Solarian philosopher, suggesting a deep, ancient wisdom within the wild. The resulting statue is a revelation. It takes the primal, powerful energy of the Veridian forest and clothes it in the elegant, timeless language of Solarian artistry, creating a figure that feels both awe-inspiring and profoundly approachable, a bridge between the cultivated garden and the deep, sacred wood. But if there is one art form that perfectly encapsulates this entire era, it is the tapestry. These were not small, private works, but colossal, communal projects that took teams of weavers years to complete, often commissioned by the new merchant guilds or entire towns to adorn their public halls. The very process of their creation was a metaphor for the age. The warp threads, the strong, vertical foundation of the tapestry, might be spun from sturdy Veridian flax, while the weft threads which carry the color and the image could be dyed Solarian silks and wools. The act of weaving literally and physically intertwined the materials of both cultures into a single, inseparable whole. The iconography woven into these massive cloth narratives is where the story truly unfolds. A single tapestry might depict a continuous scene where Solarian farmers, dressed in their distinct tunics, are shown sowing fields that border the edge of a Veridian ancient forest where Veridian hunters pursue a stag. Overhead, a Solarian sun symbol and a Veridian crescent moon might share the same sky. The narrative isn't about one group conquering the land of the other. It's about a shared landscape, a shared livelihood, a shared horizon. These tapestries served as the history books for a people who had no official chronicle, visually documenting the birth of their new, common identity for all to see every day. Crucially, this artistic renaissance was fundamentally democratic. It was not art dictated from on high by an emperor seeking to immortalize his conquests or an elder council demanding propaganda to reinforce their authority. This was art for the people, by the people, and of the people. It was funded by the wealth of merchant patrons who owed their success to the cross-border economy. It was created by artists who were themselves products of the mixed borderlands, and it was displayed in guild halls, thriving marketplaces, and even prosperous farmhouses where Solarian and Veridian families now lived as one. The art did not celebrate the glory of a distant throne or the triumph of one army over another. Instead, it celebrated the harvest, the craftsmanship of the local blacksmith, the joy of a wedding between two families from different backgrounds, the protective spirit of the local river that everyone relied upon. It turned its gaze away from the grand, divisive narratives of the past and focused on the beautiful, complex, and shared reality of the present. In doing so, this fusion art became the most powerful tool for nation building that the Borderlands ever possessed, giving a proud and beautiful voice to a new culture that was busy being born, stitch by brilliant stitch, stroke by vibrant stroke, right in front of everyone's eyes. But the very prosperity and peace of the Borderlands, the quiet triumph of a century of human connection, began to cast a long and threatening shadow in the halls of power. In the Solarian capital of Aurelion, a young, fiery prince named Cashan was preparing to ascend the Sunstone throne. He had been raised not on the nuanced chronicles of the Borderlands, but on the old, glorious epics of Solarian supremacy, tales of his great-grandfather's grand, if failed, ambition. To Cashan and his circle of like-minded advisors, the vibrant, hybrid culture of the border was not a sign of resilience. It was a symptom of a terrible sickness, a moral and cultural decay that had infected the empire's frontier. They looked at the wealthy merchant princes of Oakhaven Crossing, with their blended families and their loyalties to profit over crown, and saw not partners in prosperity, but a corrupt and dangerous fifth column. Their rhetoric was one of purification, of a need to scrape away this foreign influence and restore the empire to its imagined, pristine glory. They spoke of the Veridian taint on Solarian art, architecture, and even bloodlines as a national humiliation that demanded a forceful response. This resurgent nationalism found a willing audience among the old military aristocracy, whose influence had waned with the long peace, and who saw in a new war a chance to reclaim their former prestige and power. Simultaneously, and with chilling symmetry, a similar movement was gaining ground in the Veridian League. A charismatic war chief named Culing, from the isolated northern cantons that had been least touched by the cultural exchange, rose to prominence on the Council of Elders. His message was one of primal, visceral appeal. He stood before the council not in the fine, blended silks of the merchant class, but in rugged, traditional furs and leathers, a living symbol of the pure Veridian past. He argued that the League had grown soft, that its soul was being eroded by Solarian decadence. He pointed to the Borderland cathedrals with their Solarian arches as monuments to foreign arrogance, and he decried the sun-verdant ale not as a delicious innovation, but as a poison that was making his people forget the taste of their own ancestral drinks. For Culing and his followers, the entire century of exchange was not a period of fruitful peace, but a long, slow surrender, a cowardly refusal to finish a fight that the blessed storm had only postponed. His speeches were filled with imagery of the sacred forest being cleared for Solarian-style farms, of Veridian children forgetting the names of their own gods, and of a proud, independent people willingly shackling themselves to a foreign economic master. This narrative of cultural survival resonated deeply with those who felt left behind by the new, merchant-driven economy, those who saw their traditional way of life vanishing and yearned for a simpler, more defined enemy. These new leaders understood that to mobilize their people for conflict, they first had to conquer the past. They launched sophisticated, state-sponsored propaganda campaigns aimed at systematically dismantling the lived history of the previous 100 years. In Solaria, imperial historians were commissioned to write new, definitive accounts of the Crimson Campaign. In these texts, the storm was no longer a tragic misfortune, but a deliberate act of Veridian weather sorcery, a cowardly trick that had robbed the brave Solarian legions of their rightful victory. The period of cultural exchange was reframed not as a quiet miracle of coexistence, but as the great humiliation, a century of captivity for the stranded Solarian sons and daughters who had been forced to debase themselves and their culture under the yoke of their barbaric captors. Playwrights were paid to produce tearful melodramas about Solarian women suffering in Veridian households, and artists were ordered to paint heroic portraits of grim-faced legionaries, their gaze fixed longingly eastward, awaiting liberation. The goal was to replace the complex, empathetic memory of the Borderlands with a clean, angry narrative of victimhood and stolen glory. The Veridian propaganda machine was equally potent, but it struck a different chord, playing on fears of contamination and loss. Culing's supporters circulated lurid pamphlets illustrated with crude woodcuts, depicting Solarian merchants as sly, hook-nosed figures secretly poisoning Veridian wells or seducing Veridian daughters with foreign trinkets. They rewrote their own folk songs, removing any traces of Solarian influence and adding new, militant verses that called for a cleansing fire to sweep through the Borderlands and burn out the sun rot. They targeted the very foundation of the blended society, the second generation. These bilingual, bicultural children were publicly vilified in speeches as rootless, confused, and traitors to their blood. They were called half-bloods not as a simple description, but as a slur, implying they were inherently untrustworthy and less than fully Veridian. This rhetoric was designed to create a terrifying choice for families in the Borderlands: renounce your connections, your spouses, your very neighbors, or be branded an enemy of your own people. It was a brutal, deliberate campaign to sever the human bonds that had taken a century to form, to turn the shared hearths of the Borderlands back into dividing lines of suspicion and fear. The strain on the delicate, unofficial peace became unbearable. The first cracks appeared in the economic sphere, the very system that had for so long enforced stability. The new hawkish councils in both capitals began to pass a series of punitive trade laws, officially branding the merchant guilds of the border cities as smugglers and enemies of the state. Solarian patrols began to aggressively intercept caravans coming from the Borderlands, confiscating goods and imprisoning merchants under charges of treason. In response, Veridian authorities started to levy crippling taxes on any goods moving through their territory that showed Solarian influence or design. Almost overnight, the lucrative trade routes that were the lifeblood of the border economy began to seize up. The great merchant families who had once been the unseen rulers of the continent found their power crumbling. Their wealth was frozen, their networks disrupted, and their political influence evaporated in the face of this raw, state-sponsored hostility. The economic mutually assured destruction that had guaranteed peace for generations was being deliberately triggered by leaders who were willing to sacrifice prosperity for what they saw as a higher cause: the purification of their national soul. This economic warfare quickly bled into social violence. In Solarian border towns that had once been models of integration, imperial garrisons now turned a blind eye or even actively participated as mobs attacked shops owned by those with Veridian ties or mixed heritage. A popular tavern known for its sun-verdant ale might have its windows smashed and its stock poured into the street by thugs shouting slogans about Solarian purity. Across the border, Veridian traditionalists would desecrate the hybrid shrines, toppling the cairns and burning the offerings that represented a century of spiritual fusion. The most heartbreaking victims were the second generation, the children of two worlds who now found themselves homeless in both. A young man who had once been praised for his skill as a mediator might now be spat upon in the streets of his father's city for his Veridian mother's accent, and rejected in his mother's village for his Solarian father's features. The vibrant tapestry of the Borderlands, woven with such patience and care over 100 years, was not just fraying at the edges, it was being systematically ripped apart, thread by colorful thread, by the very hands that should have been protecting it. The intricate web of shared lives, which had seemed so strong, now proved terrifyingly fragile in the face of organized top-down hatred, pushing the entire continent to the precipice of a conflict that would seek to erase a century of progress in a single, bloody campaign. And so the curtain fell on the century of exchange, not with a final, harmonious chord, but with the harsh, grating sound of slammed doors and barricaded hearts. The vibrant Borderlands, once a living tapestry of blended life, were forcibly resegregated by imperial decree. The great merchant families saw their fortunes broken and their networks dismantled. The mixed-style cathedrals fell silent or were purged of their foreign iconography. The pigeon tongue was officially banned, and children of dual heritage were pressured to choose a single identity, a psychological amputation that left countless lives fractured. For a time, it seemed as if the hawks and purists had won, successfully burying a century of progress beneath a mountain of nationalist rhetoric and legislative suppression. The continent reverted to its old, familiar posture, two armed camps glaring at each other across a fortified border, their official histories now meticulously edited to paint the previous 100 years as a tragic era of weakness and cultural contamination. Yet for all their power, the architects of this new isolation could not achieve the impossible. They could not uninvent the sun-verdant ale. They could not tear down every Borderland-style fortress without impoverishing their own defenses. They could not make people forget the taste of a spiced meat pie that had once been a symbol of shared community. They could outlaw the language, but they could not erase the memory of its sound from the minds of those who had spoken it since childhood. The cultural fusion had sunk its roots too deep, penetrating below the topsoil of politics and into the very bedrock of daily life. What remained was a dormant landscape, a field that appeared barren on the surface but was teeming with latent life just beneath, waiting for a change in season. This dormant legacy persisted as a powerful cultural substratum, an unseen foundation upon which the hollowed-out structures of both societies now unknowingly rested. In the Solarian Empire, the administrative reforms that had been quietly adopted from Veridian models, the more efficient tax codes, the census methods, the concepts of restorative justice remained in place because they worked too well to discard. The imperial bureaucracy, for all its newfound chauvinism, had no desire to return to the chaotic pre-invasion system of record-keeping. The elegant, Veridian-inspired plumbing and heating systems in the homes of the Solarian elite were not ripped out. They were too comfortable and practical to sacrifice on the altar of purity. Similarly, in the Veridian League, the revolutionary principles of Solarian military architecture were so fundamentally superior that they became the new standard for all future fortifications, their origin quietly glossed over in military manuals. The sturdy, hybrid textiles continued to be woven because they were simply more durable and beautiful than anything that had come before. Even the suppressed pidgin language did not vanish. It retreated into the shadows, becoming a secret tongue for black marketeers, rebellious artists, and families who wished to speak of things the state was not meant to hear. These were not grand, visible monuments to unity, but rather the countless, invisible threads of utility and habit that continued to bind the two cultures together in 1,000 unacknowledged ways. Centuries later, when the political winds shifted once more, it was this very substratum that a new generation of leaders would discover and draw upon. The context was different this time, not a military crisis, but an existential environmental threat. A great blight began to devastate the continent's staple crops, a famine that respected no border and showed contempt for both Solarian sun symbols and Veridian forest totems. As panic spread and old solutions failed, a young, pragmatic historian in the Solarian archives unearthed the long-suppressed annals of the Serrated March. In its pages, she found not just a tale of conflict, but a detailed record of Veridian agricultural techniques for cultivating blight-resistant tuber varieties and Solarian methods for large-scale food preservation that had been developed during the dispersal. Simultaneously, a Veridian engineer, desperate to find a way to power quarantine hospitals, rediscovered the old schematics for the hybrid watermills that had once dotted the Borderland rivers. These were not abstract ideas from a foreign enemy. They were proven, local solutions that had been successfully implemented by their own ancestors. The shared crisis created a necessity that mirrored the one following the failed invasion. But this time, the tools for collaboration were already there, buried in their own history, waiting to be rediscovered. The past century of exchange, once branded a humiliation, was suddenly re-evaluated as a priceless repository of shared ingenuity. This rediscovery fundamentally altered the historical consciousness of both nations. The old, simplistic narrative of eternal enmity began to crumble under the weight of this new evidence. It became clear that their identities were not pure, isolated streams, but rivers that had already mingled in a deep, common aquifer. The idea that they were immutable enemies was replaced by the dawning realization that they had once been, and could be again, potential partners. When diplomats from both sides finally met to discuss a collaborative response to the famine, they did not meet as strangers. They met with the ghost of a shared past in the room. The Solarian envoy might compliment the Veridian delegation on the distinctive cut of their formal attire, unconsciously recognizing a style that had evolved from a fusion of their own ancestral fashions. The initial, tense banter might be broken by a servant offering a refreshment that, to everyone's surprise, turned out to be a direct descendant of the Sun Verdant Ale, its recipe preserved in a monastery's cookbook. These small, unexpected echoes of a common heritage acted as a powerful social lubricant, creating a sense of familiarity that bypassed decades of official hostility. They were not starting from scratch, they were resuming a conversation that had been violently interrupted but never truly ended. The eventual political union that formed was not a conquest or a surrender. It was not the victory that Emperor Aurelion II had dreamed of, achieved through legions and siege engines. Instead, it was a pragmatic federation, a compact born from shared necessity and built upon the rediscovered foundation of that hidden century. The first Parliament of the United Cantons deliberately met in the city of Oakhaven Crossing, its great hall still adorned with those magnificent fusion tapestries that told the true story of their intertwined origins. The legal framework for the new state drew heavily from the unwritten common law of the old councils of the Hearth, formalizing its principles of restorative justice and mixed mediation. The very language of government became a modernized, formal version of the old Borderland pidgin, now celebrated as a symbol of unity rather than suppressed as a mark of shame. In the long, unblinking view of history, the Crimson Campaign's failure had achieved a far more profound and lasting victory than its success ever could have. A triumphant Solarian Empire would have imposed a brittle, resentful peace, a hegemony constantly on the verge of rebellion. But the failure and the century of unintended exchange that followed created something organic and resilient. It proved that the deepest and most enduring connections are not forged in the fire of conquest, but in the slow, patient, and often accidental processes of shared living, of learning from one another, and of discovering that the other's humanity is not a threat but a gift. The invasion's spectacular collapse did not just avoid a war, it secretly laid the groundwork for a peace that was chosen, not enforced, a peace built not on the ashes of a defeated enemy, but on the rich, fertile soil of a shared past that refused to be forgotten. So the story of the failed invasion and its hidden century of exchange ultimately leaves us with a profound and counterintuitive truth. The most significant shifts in human history are rarely announced with the blast of a war horn or recorded on a victor's monument. They happen in the quiet, unrecorded spaces between people, in a shared loaf of bread broken between former enemies, in the patient teaching of a language between a captive and his overseer, in the laughter of children who see no contradiction in having two heritages. This narrative powerfully challenges the simplistic and often dangerously appealing story of us versus them. For generations, that was the only story the Solarian Empire and the Veridian League knew how to tell. But history, in its messy, organic wisdom, wrote a different one. It revealed that beneath the armor of political identity and state-sponsored hatred, the fundamental forces of human connection, curiosity, pragmatism, shared need, and even love can not only survive but can actually flourish in the most adverse circumstances imaginable. The legacy of this period is not a list of kings or a record of battles won. It is a testament to the breathtaking resilience of the human spirit and our innate capacity to adapt, not just to new environments but to each other. It stands as a permanent reminder of the shared humanity that binds us all, a common thread that can be strained, twisted, and even buried, but is incredibly difficult to sever completely. This hidden history offers a powerful and urgently needed lesson for our own often divided world. We are constantly presented with simplistic narratives that pit groups against one another, that emphasize our differences and minimize our countless shared values and common aspirations. The tale of the Solarian and Veridian people shows us the incredible cost of buying into these divisive stories, but more importantly, it shows us the transformative power that is unleashed when we consciously choose to look beyond the surface-level conflicts. It invites us to become archaeologists of our own societies, to dig beneath the political headlines and the cultural stereotypes, and to actively seek out the hidden connections that already exist. In our globalized world, these connections are everywhere, in the food we eat that blends culinary traditions from across the planet, in the technology we use that is the product of international collaboration, in the art and music that transcends language barriers to speak directly to our hearts. These are the modern equivalents of the Sun Verdant Ale and the Borderland tapestry, silent testaments to a world that is already deeply, irrevocably intertwined. Let this story, then, be a call to action, a call to look for the shared projects, the common ground, and the collaborative spirit in our own communities and across national and cultural lines. It encourages us to be like those Veridian women in the manor kitchens or those Solarian stonemasons on the cathedral walls, focusing on the practical work of building something together, brick by patient brick. The path to a more integrated and peaceful future is rarely paved by grand peace treaties alone. It is built in a million small, daily acts of recognition, respect, and cooperation. It is built when we choose to see the person behind the political label, to appreciate the beauty in a foreign tradition, and to recognize that our collective strength does not come from purity, but from a rich and dynamic diversity. The failed invasion of the Crimson Campaign, in the long lens of history, was a far greater success than any military victory could ever have been, because it forced a connection where only division was intended. It proves that our greatest hope often lies not in triumphing over others, but in stumbling, unexpectedly and beautifully, into a shared future with them. If this journey into a forgotten chapter of resilience and connection has resonated with you, we would love to hear your thoughts. What examples of unexpected cultural exchange have you witnessed in your own life? Share your reflections in the comments below, and if you're eager for more journeys into the past's most compelling and overlooked narratives, be sure to subscribe.